It was the end of October when I decided to take a break from everything. I had been working long hours every single day, and my head felt like it was constantly filled with noise. I needed silence. I needed isolation. That's why I booked a remote cabin deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. The listing said it had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no neighbors for miles. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive up was long and winding. I took a dirt road for the last hour, and my car rocked over potholes and loose gravel. Trees lined both sides, their leaves already turning golden and brown. The air got colder the higher I climbed. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over everything. The cabin itself was simple. A small wooden structure with a pitched roof, one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom that had running water but no hot shower, only cold. There was a wood stove in the main room, a stack of split logs outside, and a small solar panel that charged a couple of dim lights inside. No TV, no internet, no clocks. After unloading my bags and setting up, I lit the stove, made a sandwich, and sat on the porch in complete silence. Not a car, not a voice, not even a breeze. Just the occasional sound of a bird in the trees or the crack of a twig far off in the forest. That first night, I slept like a rock. No traffic outside, no buzzing phone. Just total darkness and stillness. The next morning, I made some instant coffee and went for a hike. There were no trails, but I had downloaded an offline map on my phone before I came up. I wandered through the woods, letting the sounds of crunching leaves and chirping birds fill my head. I didn't go too far, just far enough to feel like I was really in the middle of nowhere. Over the next few days, I fell into a rhythm. Wake up, make coffee, hike for a few hours, return, read a book or write in my journal, eat, sleep. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. My head started to clear, but that's when I started to notice little things that made me uncomfortable. It began with the sounds at night. I told myself it was just animals, maybe deer or raccoons. But sometimes, I heard something heavier, like slow, heavy footsteps on the gravel near the cabin. I kept brushing it off. Could have been a bear, I thought. But the thing was, the steps didn't sound like a bear. They sounded deliberate, measured, like someone walking slowly on 2 feet. On the fourth night, I woke up at around 2 a.m. I didn't know why at first, but then I realized I had heard something, a soft thump, not loud, but sharp enough to break my sleep. I lay there in the dark, eyes wide open, listening. I didn't hear it again, but the cabin was so quiet that even my breathing sounded loud. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and looked around. Nothing inside. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the cold night. The moon was bright, casting long shadows through the trees. I walked around the cabin slowly, shining the light in every direction. Nothing, just the trees and the dark. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat in the main room for a while, just listening. Eventually, I went back to bed. The next morning, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Behind the cabin, a few feet from the wall, I noticed boot prints, clear ones. They weren't mine. The pattern was different, and the size looked larger. They went from the woods to the back of the cabin, stopped by the wall, then turned around and disappeared back into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. I hadn't seen anyone since I got here. There were no other cabins, no ranger stations, nothing. That day, I didn't go hiking. I stayed close to the cabin and kept the hatchet I brought for firewood near me. I started to feel like maybe coming up here alone wasn't such a good idea. But I kept telling myself that it could have been a hunter, maybe someone who didn't know the cabin was occupied. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I bolted the door and pushed a chair under the handle for extra security. I didn't sleep much. Every small noise put me on edge. Just before dawn, I heard it again, the slow, steady crunch of footsteps outside. This time, they circled the cabin. I held my breath and sat up in bed, heart pounding. The steps moved past the window, paused, and then slowly faded away into the woods. I waited until the sun was fully up before I stepped outside. More boot prints circling the cabin. A new set, overlapping the older ones. My throat felt dry. I packed my bag quickly and decided I needed to leave, even if it meant cutting the trip short. I didn't feel safe anymore. I started loading my car when I noticed something strange. My front tire was flat. Not low, flat. I walked around and saw that the rear one on the same side was also flat. Not a puncture from a rock either. Someone had slashed them. The cuts were clean, straight, like from a knife. That was when panic really set in. I was alone, with no cell service, in a remote mountain cabin, and someone had deliberately made it impossible for me to leave. I went back inside and locked the door. I put a heavy log in front of it, closed all the blinds, and sat by the stove with the hatchet in my hand. I felt trapped, couldn't run. I had no idea who was out there, or how long they had been watching me. I stayed like that for hours, only moving to drink some water or peek out the window. By the afternoon, I came up with a plan. I had seen a forest road a few miles back when I first arrived. If I could make it there, I might be able to flag someone down or find a place with signal. But I needed to wait until morning. I didn't want to risk walking through the woods in the dark. That night was the worst. Every couple of hours, I heard movement outside. Twigs snapping, footsteps crunching. Once even the soft sound of something brushing against the wall. I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner of the main room, staring at the front door, gripping the hatchet until my hand went numb. At first light, I put on my backpack, grabbed some food and water, and slipped out the back. I didn't take the trail I had used for hiking. I cut straight through the woods, moving as fast as I could while staying quiet. I kept looking behind me, expecting to see someone following, but I never did. After about 3 hours of hiking, I found the road. It was narrow and barely used, but it was something. I followed it downhill, hoping it would lead to a larger road or a ranger station. Another hour passed before I heard the sound of an engine. I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms like a madman. A pickup truck came around the bend and stopped. The driver was an older man, and he looked at me with concern. I didn't explain everything, just that I had car trouble and needed help. He let me in and drove me to the nearest small town, about 45 minutes away. There, I called for a tow truck and filed a report with the sheriff. When they went back to check the cabin, they said it looked like someone had been living off and on in the woods nearby. They found an old tent, food wrappers, and even binoculars hidden under a camouflage tarp. No one was there when they searched. Whoever it was, they were gone. I never went back to get my things. The sheriff said they could collect the basics, but I told them to leave whatever wasn't important. I didn't want any reminders. I sold the car not long after and never took a solo trip like that again. To this day, I don't know who was out there watching me. Maybe just someone living off-grid, or maybe someone more dangerous. I try not to think about what might have happened if I had stayed one more night. All I know is that remote silence I wanted so badly turned into the loudest fear I've ever felt. And I'll never forget that. I needed a break from everything. That was the first thing that made me start looking for places to get away. I had been stuck in a loop, work, home, repeat, and the city noise never seemed to stop. My sleep was getting worse. I couldn't focus. I wasn't really living. I just existed from one task to the next. I didn't tell anyone I was going, just booked a small off-grid cabin deep in the mountains of Idaho. It was isolated, no cell service, and surrounded by miles of forest. That was exactly what I wanted, quiet, no people, no distractions. I packed light, just some clothes, canned food, water containers, a solar lantern, a propane stove, a knife, and a sleeping bag. The cabin didn't have electricity or running water, but it had a roof, a bed frame, and a wood stove. That was good enough for me. The weather forecast said clear skies, cool nights. I planned to stay 4 nights. Hike during the day, sleep early, clear my head. I was hoping the silence would help me think again. Getting there was a trip in itself. I parked my car at the end of a dirt road and hiked about 2 miles uphill. The cabin sat on a small ridge surrounded by pine trees. It looked weathered but sturdy. One small window, a door that creaked loudly, and a deck that faced a shallow ravine. There was no sign of people. No trash, no tire marks, nothing. Just birds and wind. felt perfect. The first day went as planned. I arrived, unpacked, and walked around the area to get a feel for it. There was an old path behind the cabin that led to a stream. I followed it, filled my water bottles, and boiled it once I got back. I set up my sleeping bag, made a small dinner, and sat on the deck until sunset. The stars came out one by one, clearer than I'd seen in years. I slept early that night, the kind of sleep that knocks you out cold. The second day, I woke up early and went hiking. I found animal tracks, deer, maybe a fox. The forest was quiet, like it was holding its breath. The only sounds were from birds and branches shifting in the breeze. I didn't see any people. I didn't even hear a plane overhead. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door was cracked open. I was sure I had latched it. The wind was calm all day. Nothing looked disturbed, though. My bag was in the same spot, and my stuff hadn't been touched. I brushed it off as maybe I hadn't latched it properly. I locked it this time, double-checked it, and went on with my day. That night, I heard something outside. It was faint, like crunching leaves. I told myself it was probably an animal. I didn't get up. I just lay there listening until it stopped. On the third morning, I saw boot prints near the steps. Clear, heavy, not mine. They weren't fresh, but they hadn't been there the day before. They circled around to the side of the cabin, then back into the trees. That set something off in me. I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. I checked my bag. Everything was still there, but I started to carry my knife everywhere, just in case. I spent most of that day walking in circles near the cabin, trying to see if I could spot anyone. I found nothing, just more forest. But something felt wrong now. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like something was watching. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every small noise made my heart jump. I kept the lantern on low beside me and kept my knife in my hand. Just after midnight, I heard footsteps on the deck. Slow, steady, then stopping. I didn't move. I lay still, trying not to breathe loud. After about a minute, I heard the doorknob move. It didn't turn all the way, but I heard it jiggle. Then the steps moved away. I didn't sleep after that. I waited until first light, packed my bag, and decided I was going to leave early. But when I stepped outside, I saw more tracks. This time, there were two sets. One came from the woods, the other circled the cabin the opposite way. Both had heavy treads, like hiking boots. My heart was racing. I knew I had to get out. I started down the trail fast, trying not to run, but moving quicker than before. Every little sound made me whip my head around. I didn't see anyone, but I felt them. Halfway down the trail, I saw something hanging from a low tree branch. A piece of blue cloth, tied like a ribbon. It wasn't mine. I hadn't seen it coming up. I didn't stop to check it. I just kept moving. When I reached the car, I was almost shaking. The driver's side door was unlocked. I always lock my car. Always. I checked inside, nothing missing, but the glove box was open. I drove out of there faster than I should have, dirt flying from the tires. I didn't stop until I hit paved road again. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting someone to be following. No one was. When I finally reached the nearest town, I pulled into a gas station and just sat there for 20 minutes. I didn't know what I was feeling. Anger? Fear? Confusion? I didn't report it. What would I say? No crime had technically happened. Nothing stolen, no proof anyone did anything illegal. But I know what I felt. I know those tracks weren't mine. I know someone tried the door. I know someone was up there, maybe watching me the whole time. Weeks later, I still think about it. I still feel that pressure in my chest when I remember the jiggling doorknob. I moved my apartment to a higher floor. I check locks 3 times before bed. I haven't gone hiking alone since. I don't know who those people were or what they wanted. Maybe they were just passing through. Maybe they thought the cabin was empty. Or maybe they had been watching for longer than I thought. I'll never go back there. I don't need to. I got the quiet I was looking for. But I also got something else. A reminder that out there, where no one can hear you, you're never really as alone as you think. I needed a break. That's really all it was at first. I'd been working 2 jobs back to back for most of the year, barely sleeping, barely seeing anyone, just trying to keep myself afloat. I wasn't even thinking clearly anymore. There were moments when I'd catch myself staring at the wall for a full minute before snapping back. I'd forget where I was while walking down the street. I knew I needed to get away for a bit, somewhere quiet, somewhere with no people. So when I found this small, cheap cabin listing online, way up in the northern woods near the border, I booked it immediately. It looked plain. 1 room, with stove, no internet, off-grid. It was a good 4-hour drive from my place in the city, and even when I arrived at the nearby town, I still had another 40-minute drive through dirt roads and winding gravel trails to reach the place. It was already evening when I pulled up. The cabin sat on the edge of a dense forest, just a few feet away from a narrow lake. The water was still. The air smelled like pine and moss. It was exactly what I was looking for. I unpacked my things from the trunk of my car. Just the basics. Cans of food, water, a camp stove, some clothes, a lantern, a couple books. There was no electricity, but there were plenty of candles inside the place and a small woodpile next to the door. I could make this work. The first night was peaceful. I sat on the little porch and watched the trees. The wind made that soft rustling sound through the branches, and the lake had this quiet, glassy look to it that made me feel calm for the first time in months. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next few days were mostly uneventful. I read, I cooked simple meals, I chopped a bit of wood for the stove. I tried to keep a routine. Mornings were cold, and the nights even colder, but the stove warmed the cabin quickly. There were no neighbors, no trails, no other buildings, just trees and silence. Around the 3rd night, I started noticing something strange. First, it was just a noise. I woke up sometime after midnight to what I thought was an animal stepping on dry leaves near the window. It was faint, but definitely footsteps. I sat up and listened. I didn't move. For maybe a full minute, I could hear slow, steady steps circling the cabin. Then silence. I told myself it was probably a deer, or a fox, maybe a raccoon. The next morning, I checked outside. I expected to see tracks, something in the dirt, but there was nothing. No disturbed leaves, no paw prints. The area looked untouched. I shrugged it off and went about my day, but I couldn't stop thinking about those steps. The next night, I left a small pot with some rice on the back porch, just in case it was an animal. In the morning, the pot was still there. The rice was untouched. By the 5th night, I was getting uneasy. The noises had returned. This time they started earlier, just after I'd gotten into bed. The steps were clearer now, more deliberate. Not like an animal anymore. They circled the cabin again, then stopped. I lit the lantern and stayed awake, just sitting upright in bed, staring at the door. At some point, I must have drifted off. When I woke up, the sun was up, and everything looked normal. But I saw something that hadn't been there before. A stone had been placed on the porch. A small, flat stone, right in front of the door, like someone had set it there on purpose. That's when I started to feel afraid. I picked up the stone and walked it down to the water. I tossed it in and watched the ripples disappear. I spent the day looking for signs of someone. Anything out of place in the woods, any sign of a trail or footprints. Nothing. The trees stood still. No sounds. No paths. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair. I didn't have any weapons on me. The best I could do was a heavy flashlight and a hammer from my toolbox. I kept them close. The sounds came again, but this time they didn't stay outside. I heard the back door creak. I had locked it earlier, but it didn't matter. It wasn't a strong door. I heard soft, slow footsteps across the floorboards in the kitchen area. I didn't move. I sat there holding the flashlight and the hammer, heart racing. The steps moved closer, then stopped just before the bedroom. I didn't hear anything for the next hour. I stayed frozen. Eventually, morning light started to come through the cracks in the window. I got up, flashlight still on, and walked through the cabin. The back door was cracked open. The cold morning air was pouring in. The chair I'd put in front of the main door was still in place, but there was a second stone on the floor. I left it there and walked outside. I felt like I was being watched, but I saw no one. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing. I checked the trunk of my car. It was still locked. Everything was still there. I stayed outside most of the day. I didn't want to be in the cabin anymore. When the sun started to go down, I built a fire out back and sat next to it until the sky went black. I kept the hammer in my lap the whole time. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair in the center of the room with the lantern on and waited. The cabin stayed silent. No footsteps, no creaks, no new stones, just silence. I thought maybe it was over. Maybe whoever it was had gotten bored or moved on. I made it through another day, and then another. But on the 9th day, I heard something worse. I was out by the lake around sunset. I'd been washing some dishes in a bucket and trying to get myself to calm down. That's when I heard my own voice. Came from the woods, just behind me, said my name, exactly how I say it, like a perfect recording. But I was alone. I turned, scanning the tree line. I didn't move for a long time. I just stared into the forest. There was nothing there. The trees looked the same, but the air had changed. It felt heavier, like something was standing right at the edge of the trees, just behind the trunks, just out of sight. I ran inside. I locked both doors. I pushed the table against the back one. I shut all the curtains. I turned off the lantern. I sat in the corner of the room with the hammer and the flashlight and didn't move. The voice didn't come back, but I couldn't sleep. I waited until morning, then packed everything. I threw it all into the car and didn't even care how I arranged it. I just needed to go, but the car wouldn't start. I turned the key and got nothing, not even a click. I popped the hood and checked the battery. Nothing looked wrong. No chewed wires, no leaks, but it was dead. I didn't have cell service out here. The nearest town was nearly an hour away by foot. I took my backpack, filled it with water and whatever food I could carry, and started walking. I didn't look back at the cabin. I walked until my legs burned. The dirt road stretched on and on. The trees closed in on both sides. I stopped only once to drink some water, then kept moving. After what felt like hours, I saw a car coming down the road. It was a Forest Service truck. I flagged it down. The guy inside looked confused to see me, but he gave me a ride into town. I didn't tell him everything, just that my car broke down and I needed help. He gave me a lift to a mechanic. They towed the car out the next day. When they checked it, the battery was missing. Not dead, missing, completely gone. Someone had taken it. I didn't go back to the cabin. I asked the mechanic to keep the car and ship it to me later. I took the next bus back to the city. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I think about those footsteps every night when I lie down to sleep. I think about the stone on the porch, the second stone in the cabin, and the sound of my own voice calling me from the trees. There were no ghosts, no monsters, just someone, a real person, watching me, and the worst part is, I don't know how long they were there before I noticed. It started as a quiet trip to reset my mind. After months of dealing with city noise, long hours, and constant screens, I wanted something simple. No phone, no laptop, just me and a remote cabin tucked deep into the woods of northern Minnesota. I rented the place for 2 weeks. No neighbors within a mile radius. The owner warned me that cell service would be spotty at best, but that was exactly what I needed. Silence, space. I arrived in the early afternoon. The drive was long and slow, most of it on cracked roads that eventually turned to gravel. The cabin itself looked older than the pictures. Small, boxy, and standing on thick wooden stilts above slightly sloping land. The lake it faced was narrow, surrounded by trees so thick the shoreline disappeared into green shadows. The air smelled like pine and earth. The only sound was the wind passing through the trees. Inside, the place was clean but bare bones. A small kitchen, a wood stove in the corner, 1 bedroom, and a bathroom with running water that smelled faintly metallic. No TV, a shelf of old books, some fishing rods in the corner. The kind of place you come to when you want to be forgotten for a while. I unpacked slowly, set my duffel bag on the bed, stored some canned food and dry goods in the cabinets. There was a little firewood stacked near the stove. I checked the locks on the doors and windows and walked down to the dock behind the cabin. The water was clear, glassy, and cold. A loon drifted far off, barely moving. Felt peaceful, too peaceful. The first night passed without much trouble. I kept the lanterns low and sat by the wood stove. I could hear every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind tapping the windows. That was expected. It takes time for the brain to settle in a place like that. I went to bed early, woke up once to pee, and then slept straight through till morning. The next few days blurred together. I made simple meals, read from an old novel I found on the shelf, took short walks on the trail behind the cabin. It was overgrown in places but still usable. I didn't go far. I didn't bring a compass or GPS, and the last thing I wanted was to get lost. There was an odd kind of silence in those woods. No distant hum of cars or far-off voices, just the occasional crack of a twig underfoot or the rustle of a squirrel. On the fourth day, things started to feel off. I woke up to find the screen door open. I was sure I latched it the night before. Creaked when it moved, so I would have noticed it. At first, I thought maybe I hadn't closed it properly. The wind could have pushed it open, but there wasn't much wind that night. Still, I shrugged it off. Cabin quirks. But then, more little things started happening. A pair of socks I left by the fireplace vanished. I found them 2 days later in the shed out back, slightly damp and covered in pine needles. I hadn't gone near the shed. I checked the lock and found it unlatched. Nothing inside seemed out of place, but I started feeling uneasy. I convinced myself it was just forgetfulness. Maybe I'd gone into the shed earlier and forgot. Maybe I dropped the socks on the way. But deep down, something felt wrong. I started locking both doors at night. I pushed a chair under the handle, something I hadn't done since I lived alone in a bad part of town. That next night, I had trouble sleeping. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Every creak felt louder. Every breeze felt like footsteps. At one point, I thought I heard something outside, a crunch of leaves. I sat up and listened. It stopped. I waited, heart thudding. Nothing. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I found a smear of dirt across the back window. It looked like a handprint, but it was hard to tell. The smudge was too wide, almost like someone had leaned their whole palm against the glass. I cleaned it with a rag and tried not to think about it. I didn't sleep the next night. Instead, I stayed up, lights off, watching the windows. I moved from room to room slowly, keeping my steps quiet. I felt stupid at first, like I was overreacting, but that feeling disappeared when I heard something knock against the side of the cabin. Just once. Not loud, but enough. I stood frozen in the kitchen. I didn't breathe for a while. Then I moved to the window by the sink and peeked through a crack in the curtain. The yard looked empty. Trees, shadows, nothing moved. The knock didn't come again. I stayed in that spot until almost dawn. When the sky started turning gray, I let myself breathe again. I stepped out onto the porch slowly, barefoot, listening. There were footprints in the dirt beside the stairs. Bare feet, longer than mine. Why, I took a picture with my phone, even though there was no service to send it anywhere. I wanted to leave, but something kept me there. Stubbornness, maybe pride. I told myself I could handle a few weird nights, that it was just someone messing around. Maybe a squatter, a hermit, someone who didn't like outsiders. I stayed near the cabin for the next 2 days, kept a hammer near me at all times, didn't go for walks, didn't sleep. The 6th night, it got worse. Around midnight, I heard someone trying the front door. The knob turned slowly, then stopped, then turned again. I sat on the floor near the corner with the hammer in my hand, staring at the door. I hadn't turned the porch light on. There was no sound besides the knob turning, then silence. It didn't open. After what felt like an hour, I crept to the back window and peeked out again. Nothing. No one. I went back to my corner and waited until morning. That day, I finally packed. I stuffed everything back into the duffel, grabbed the food I could carry, and locked everything. I drove away as soon as the sun came up. I didn't even clean the place up. I just left. On the way back, my tires crunched something on the dirt road. I stopped and got out. It was a small pile of rocks stacked neatly in the middle of the path. Not natural, deliberate. 5 flat stones, each a little smaller than the one beneath it. Like a totem or marker. I kicked it aside and kept driving. When I got to the nearest town, I filled up the tank and used the gas station's Wi-Fi. I looked up news from the area. Nothing recent. No reports of missing people. No talk of break-ins or strange activity. I didn't know what I expected to find. A week after I got home, I went through the pictures on my phone. I stopped when I reached the one of the footprint. I zoomed in. The details were clear, but what caught my eye was something in the background. A figure, between 2 trees, barely visible, blurry, and almost blending with the trunks. But definitely there. Tall, lean, no shirt. I deleted the photo. I never reported anything. I didn't reach out to the cabin owner. I left a review saying the place was peaceful and clean. I didn't want to think about it anymore. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I remember the sound of the doorknob turning in the dark, and I wonder how many nights that figure stood watching through the trees, waiting, and how close it ever got without me knowing. I had been planning the cabin trip for a while. I was feeling burned out from work, and my sleep had been a mess. I needed a break, somewhere quiet, far from people, noise, and city routines. I had no family, no real close friends left in the city, and I had saved up just enough for a week-long trip out to the woods. I found this small cabin listed on a local rental site. It was deep in the northern woods, around 4 miles from the nearest town. The photos looked simple, just a 1-room wooden structure with a kitchen, a bed, a small bathroom, and a wood stove. It had a tiny front porch, no TV, no internet, and not even a phone line. Just what I needed. The owner lived about 30 minutes away and left the keys under a rock by the front step. I packed up everything I thought I'd need. Canned food, bottled water, batteries, a flashlight, extra clothes, a small hatchet, and a cheap hunting knife I kept in the glove box. I also brought my old camping gear just in case. Sleeping bag, fire starter, mess kit, and a portable gas stove. Even though the cabin had a stove and small fridge, I always preferred to be over-prepared. I drove up on a Monday morning in early fall. The leaves were just starting to turn. The air was cooler, crisp, and dry, and the roads got quieter the farther I went. By the time I turned off onto the dirt path that led to the cabin, I hadn't seen another car for over half an hour. The path was narrow and winding, surrounded by tall pine and maple trees that blocked out the sky. It felt like entering a tunnel, and I liked that. I followed it slowly for about 10 minutes until the trees opened up into a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. It looked like the photos, a little run-down but solid. A single chimney, old wood panels, a tin roof. I parked the car just beside the porch, grabbed the key from under the flat rock, and let myself in. The inside smelled faintly of cedar and old firewood. The place was clean enough, nothing fancy. Just a bed, a wooden table, a small counter with a sink, an old refrigerator, and a narrow bathroom with a stand-up shower. I brought in my stuff, set it all down, and sat on the edge of the bed to take it all in. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. No cars, no dogs barking, no talking, just wind and birds. That first day was peaceful. I made a small fire in the wood stove, warmed up some soup, and read a book for a few hours. I went outside around sunset and walked to a nearby creek the owner had mentioned in the rental listing. It was about 100 yards through the trees to the east of the cabin. The water was shallow and clear, running over smooth rocks. I stood there for a while just watching it. It felt like I had stepped out of time. I slept easy that night. The next morning I woke up early. The sun filtered in through the trees and filled the room with a soft, golden light. I had eggs and toast, packed a small bag, and spent most of the day exploring the area. There weren't any trails really, but the woods weren't too thick in places, and I found old deer paths I followed for a while. I didn't see a single person, just birds, squirrels, and one scared little fox that darted away when it saw me. By the time I got back to the cabin, I was tired, sweaty, and a little scraped up from brush. I took a long shower and cooked a proper meal. As night came in, the woods got darker than I'd ever seen before. No streetlights, no porch lights from neighboring houses. Just complete darkness outside, thick and still. I turned in early. It was around the third day that I started noticing little things. First, it was small. When I walked out to the creek in the afternoon, I saw footprints in the damp soil near the edge. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked there that morning, and the prints were fresh, still defined, not softened by wind or rain. They looked like regular boots, maybe hiking boots, hard to tell exactly, but the tread pattern didn't match mine. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. My mind tried to come up with a reason. Maybe a hunter, maybe the cabin owner checking in. But the prints led out of the woods on the other side of the creek and didn't come from my direction. Later that evening, I went to bring in some firewood from the stack behind the cabin, and I noticed something strange again. The pile looked disturbed. A few logs had rolled off to the side, as if someone had grabbed at them carelessly. I had stacked the wood neatly when I arrived, but now it looked like someone had dug through it. Again, I brushed it off. Maybe a raccoon. Maybe I was remembering it wrong, but I felt uneasy. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every noise outside felt louder. Every creak in the wood, every gust of wind scraping the branches against the tin roof made me freeze. I kept checking the front window, even though I saw nothing. At one point, around 2 a.m., I thought I heard something out back. A rustling. Not animals. Not the wind. Something slow, cautious, deliberate. I didn't have the courage to look out. The next morning, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I made coffee, swept the floor, and cleaned the kitchen counter even though it wasn't dirty. Around noon, I walked back to the creek. The footprints were gone, washed away maybe. But across the creek, deeper in the woods, I saw something hanging from a low tree branch. I walked around to check, and when I got closer, I saw it was a small bundle of twigs tied together with string. It was shaped like a little man, almost like something a kid might make in art class. It looked recent, fresh string, new cuts in the wood. I left it alone and went straight back. I stayed inside the rest of the day. I locked the door even though it felt silly, and I started keeping the knife nearby. I hadn't seen anyone, but I could feel it now. Someone had been around, maybe still was. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees, just barely visible through the gaps in the branches. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay there with my ears wide open, straining to catch every sound. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not animals, not wind. Real, slow footsteps crunching the gravel just outside the cabin. They walked around the side, then stopped. Then I heard nothing for maybe 5 full minutes. Then came a soft knock, just once, on the back wall of the cabin. I stayed frozen. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I stared at the ceiling until my eyes watered. I didn't dare look out. Then nothing. For the rest of the night, not a single sound. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. There were boot prints again, clear in the dirt. Someone had walked around the place, paused by the firewood, then gone toward the creek. I followed the tracks a little, but they disappeared into the brush. I walked back and made a decision. I was going to leave early. I had booked the place for a week, but it wasn't worth it. I didn't feel safe. Something was wrong. I started packing that afternoon. Just the essentials first: food, tools, clothes. I planned to load the car in the morning and leave before sunrise. I kept the knife in my hand almost all day. I checked the windows over and over again. Around 6 p.m., as the sun was going down, I walked out to the car to see if I could fit everything in without making 2 trips. That's when I noticed the tire. The rear driver's side tire was slashed. Not flat, slashed. A clean cut right through the sidewall. My stomach dropped. I checked the others. The front passenger tire had a similar cut. I stood there, shaking, unable to think clearly. Someone had done this. That meant they were watching, waiting. They had time. They knew I was here alone. I ran back into the cabin and locked the door. I tried to call for help, but of course, no signal. No landline. I considered trying to walk the 4 miles back to town, but it would be dark in less than an hour, and I didn't trust the woods anymore. I felt trapped. That night was the longest of my life. I stayed up with the knife in one hand and a flashlight in the other, crouched by the window. I kept the lights off. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard movement again, this time right up on the porch. Wood creaked under weight. Slow steps, then silence. I didn't breathe. I just waited. Then I saw it. Through the gap in the curtain, I saw a shape move past the front window. A man, not tall, stocky, wearing a jacket and a beanie. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the outline. He moved slowly, as if he was listening. He stopped at the door, then stepped off the porch and disappeared into the trees. I stayed in place until the sun rose. The next morning, I didn't waste time. I loaded my backpack, grabbed the essentials: knife, flashlight, water, food, and locked the cabin. I didn't care about the rest. I set off on foot toward the dirt road. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. Every few minutes, I looked behind me. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees, but I didn't wait to check. I just kept walking. I made it to the main road 2 hours later. A passing truck picked me up. I told the driver that my car had I booked a small off-grid cabin last November, way up in northern Maine, close to the border, where the roads turn to dirt before winter really locks everything down. I had been burned out from work, drained from city life, and needed a place to clear my head. The listing said there was no running water, no cell service, and no neighbors for miles. That was exactly what I was looking for. I wanted real silence, real distance, something I could feel in my bones. Something about being alone in the woods in the cold made me feel more alive than anything else. The drive took 10 hours from Boston. By the time I turned off the last paved road and started bouncing along the dirt track through the trees, the sun was already dipping low. The directions said to look for a rusted mailbox and a hanging license plate nailed to a birch. I found it, just barely visible under some early snow. The trail was narrow, winding, and covered in fallen leaves and half-melted slush. I had to drive slow, creeping through the trees. I didn't see the cabin until I was nearly on top of it. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by dense pine and spruce. The cabin was small, one story, made from hand-cut logs. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the wood was black from decades of snow and rain. There was a small porch, a woodpile stacked neatly beside it, and a metal chimney poking up from the center. The door was unlocked, just like the owner had promised in the listing. Inside, the air smelled like cold ash and pine. The interior was simple. One small table, 2 chairs, a cot with a thick wool blanket, a wood stove, and a shelf with some canned goods and a few basics. No electricity, no plumbing. There was an outhouse maybe 20 feet behind the cabin. Water had to be drawn from a hand pump about 100 yards out, near a tiny stream. I brought a bunch of jugs with me to fill. I didn't mind roughing it. I liked the work of it, the chopping, hauling, fetching. It made the hours feel fuller. The first night was peaceful. I made a small fire in the wood stove, cooked some rice and beans, and read by headlamp until I got tired. The forest was dead quiet. No cars, no hum from power lines, just wind in the trees and the occasional creak from the cabin's joints settling in the cold. I slept like a rock. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was a pale, icy glow through the trees. I pulled on boots and my jacket and went out to get water. The hand pump was stiff, but it worked. I filled the jugs, brought them back, boiled some for coffee. I spent most of the day walking around the woods. I wasn't worried about getting lost. I'd studied the area pretty well. There weren't many trails, just old logging roads and deer paths. The woods were thick and tangled, full of wet leaves and fallen branches. But it was beautiful. That second night, I went to bed around 9. The fire was burning low, but I let it go out, bundled up in the wool blanket. I must have dozed off pretty fast. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Not because of a sound exactly, more like a feeling, like something had shifted. The air felt different, I listened hard. The wind had died down. I couldn't hear anything, not even the trees. That silence wasn't peaceful. Felt wrong, heavy. I laid there, still, heart thudding a little faster now. I was trying to convince myself it was nothing when I heard it. A crunch. Snow or leaves. Very faint. Then another. Footsteps. Not animal. Not fast or scattered. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from outside. They stopped after a few steps. Then nothing. I didn't move. I just lay there staring at the ceiling in the dark. I didn't have a gun. Just a hatchet and a pocket knife. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. No more sounds. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again. In the morning, I went out and looked. The snow around the cabin was mostly melted, but there were patches of frost in the shaded areas. I couldn't see any prints. Nothing disturbed. I told myself it had just been my imagination. The woods play tricks on you. The creak of a tree, a branch falling, maybe even a deer walking close. I tried to brush it off. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin, gathered more wood, hauled more water, cleaned up the inside a bit. I still felt uneasy though. That night, I made sure the fire was stacked high. I brought the hatchet inside, kept it beside the cot. I even wedged the door with a heavy piece of wood, just in case. Around midnight, I woke again. Same feeling, that shift in the air, cold, thick silence. I held my breath. Then I heard it again. A single step, closer this time, then another, and another, right outside the cabin wall. I could hear the crunch of boots on leaves and old snow. Then it stopped. I sat up slowly. My hands were shaking. I reached for the hatchet. I didn't have my headlamp on, but there was a faint orange glow from the fire. I couldn't hear anything now, not even breathing. I stayed like that for a long time. Eventually, the fire died down. The cold crept in, but there were no more sounds. I didn't sleep again. The next morning, I walked a wide circle around the cabin. This time, I found prints. Not boots, but shoes. Thin soles. Not hiking gear. Just 3 prints in the soft frost. Then they stopped. Nothing else. No return prints. No signs of someone going back. Just 3 steps leading toward the side of the cabin. And then nothing. Like they vanished. That scared me more than anything. I couldn't explain it. I tried to tell myself they were old. Maybe someone else who came to the cabin before me. But they were fresh. The frost around them was melted slightly. They hadn't been there the day before. I started keeping the hatchet with me everywhere, even when I went to the outhouse. I stopped going out far into the woods. I kept a fire going all day. I barely slept. Every noise made my heart jump. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was paranoia, like I was being watched. I even started talking to myself just to hear a voice. 2 nights later, it got worse. I had just laid down, exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. Then there was a thud, loud, on the porch. Not like a step, more like something heavy being dropped. Then a scraping sound, long and slow, metal on wood. I sat up, heart pounding, holding the hatchet tight. It stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. Then I heard the door creak, just slightly, not opening but pressure on it, like someone testing it. The wedge held, then silence again. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. At first light, I finally got up the nerve to open the door. There was a dead rabbit on the porch, its neck twisted, his belly cut open, laid out on the wood like some kind of offering, or a message. I gagged, stepped back inside, and shut the door. That day, I packed up. I couldn't take it anymore. I loaded everything in my car, locked the cabin out of habit even though I knew it wouldn't matter, and drove out fast. I didn't stop until I was back on paved road. Back in Boston, I tried to tell a few friends what happened. But how do you explain something like that without sounding crazy? There was no proof, just a weird feeling, a few footsteps, a dead animal. No one believes that kind of story. Not really. Weeks passed. I tried to forget it, but I kept thinking about the shoe prints. The way they stopped like the person just disappeared. Or the way the door creaked under pressure. That slow, quiet testing of the wood. That was the part that really stuck with me. I never reported it. What would I say? That someone followed me into the woods to scare me? That some stranger walked miles into a remote forest, waited for me to sleep, and left no trace except a dead rabbit? There was no way to explain it. Months later, I saw a listing online. Someone was renting that same cabin. Different owner, same photos. I almost clicked out of it, but something made me look closer. The description had changed. It now said, "Do not stay alone." That's when I knew it hadn't been in my head. Whatever happened out there, someone else must have felt it too. Maybe worse. I don't think about it much anymore. But I don't camp alone now. I don't go off-grid. And when the woods go silent, when the wind dies and the trees stop creaking, I don't stay to find out what's waiting in that stillness. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I finally turned off the highway and onto the narrow gravel road that led deep into the woods. I had rented a small off-grid cabin for 2 weeks to get away from work, the city noise, and everything that had started weighing down on me. I wanted no distractions, just nature, silence, and space to think. I was burned out. I had been working long hours, skipping sleep, skipping meals, dealing with people I didn't like. Everything felt loud all the time. My head hurt constantly. I needed out. The cabin was an old A-frame tucked about 4 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by thick forest and no neighbors in sight. I found it online on one of those websites where people rent out their remote homes. The photos showed a small wooden structure with a tin roof, a fire pit out front, and a little porch that looked over a wide clearing. There was no cell signal out there. That's what made me choose it. It was perfect. By the time I arrived, the sun was low. The drive had taken longer than I thought. The trees swallowed up the light quicker than in the city. As soon as I turned off the car and opened the door, the quiet hit me hard. It wasn't completely silent. There were crickets, leaves rustling, maybe a bird far off, but it was a different kind of quiet. No cars, no voices, no background noise. It felt heavy and thick, like it was pressing against my ears. It was what I wanted, or at least I thought it was. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, but not by much. It was simple. 1 room, a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a little stove, and a wood-burning fireplace. No electricity, no plumbing. A rain barrel for water, an outhouse about 30 feet out in the woods behind the cabin. There were stacked wood piles on the side and some basic tools on hooks, an axe, a shovel, a saw. I unpacked the car, brought in the dry food I'd brought, set my sleeping bag on the mattress, and lit a few candles. I had my flashlight, a gas lantern, and a few books. I sat on the porch for a while, listening to the wind in the trees. The stars came out bright, brighter than I ever saw them in the city. That night, I went to bed early. I didn't even try to read. My body was tired. My head was finally quiet. I slept hard. The next day passed slow. I cut wood for a while, walked through the trees, and sat on a log near the edge of the clearing. I didn't do much else. I didn't want to. It was peaceful, and that was the point. I made coffee in the morning on the little camp stove, ate granola and jerky for lunch, cooked rice and canned beans for dinner. I wasn't trying to live fancy. I was just trying to reset my brain. I stayed busy enough. I made sure the fire would stay dry, cleaned up some spider webs in the corners of the cabin, fixed a loose board on the porch. Time moved slower out there. Everything felt real again. My phone stayed in my bag off. I didn't miss it. On the 3rd day, something small changed. It was evening just before sundown. I was sitting on the porch, sipping from a mug of hot water, watching the light fade through the trees. Then I saw something out of place across the clearing. Something small and light-colored on the ground near the tree line. I didn't remember it being there before. I walked over to it. It was a shirt, a gray t-shirt, slightly crumpled, looked worn and dirty, like it had been outside for days. I picked it up. There was no blood or anything like that, just grass stains and some faint holes, like it had been dragged or left in the elements. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't mine. I looked around, listened carefully. The woods were quiet. There were no trails nearby, no paths, no signs that someone had been through recently. But maybe a hiker dropped it. Maybe someone camped out here before me and left it behind. Still, it gave me a weird feeling. I walked back to the cabin, folded the shirt, and set it on the porch railing. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept hearing sounds in the woods, sticks snapping, leaves crunching. I told myself it was animals, deer, raccoons, the usual stuff. Still, I stayed awake longer than I meant to, holding the flashlight in my sleeping bag, waiting for nothing. In the morning, the shirt was gone. At first, I thought maybe the wind blew it off the railing. I looked around the porch, checked the grass. Nothing. Then I thought maybe I brought it inside and forgot. I searched the cabin. No shirt. It was just gone. That's when I started paying more attention. The next few days, I kept an eye on the woods. I started waking up earlier, sitting outside more, taking notes in a little notebook about what I saw or heard. I noticed things, small things at first. A rock out of place. A branch that looked like it was snapped on purpose. Scratches on the bark of a tree about chest high. Not claw marks, just light scraping like someone ran a knife or a tool over it. I started locking the cabin door with the latch when I went to sleep, even though it was just a wooden bar. I brought the axe inside. I kept my flashlight and knife next to my bed. I still told myself it was probably nothing, just leftover signs of campers or hunters. The woods are big. People pass through. Things get moved. But I started noticing that things were getting moved closer. On the 7th day, I found footprints near the outhouse. They weren't mine. I wore big, heavy hiking boots. These were smaller, narrower, barefoot. The heel and toe were clear in the dirt. Someone walked out there with no shoes on. More than one set of prints. I stared at them for a long time. I didn't want to go in the outhouse. I did anyway. Nothing inside. That day, I carried the axe with me everywhere I walked. I stopped going too far into the trees. I stayed within sight of the cabin. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but I didn't want to pack up and leave. I had 1 week left, and I kept thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. But something felt off now. The quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like it was watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing movement outside. Not just footsteps, but breathing. Slow, heavy breathing. I turned off my lantern and crouched by the window. The moonlight lit up the clearing faintly. I saw something moving across the grass. Slow, careful. A shape, human, crawling low to the ground. I froze. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The shape moved up to the woodpile and stopped. It stayed there for a long time. I could barely see it, but I could tell it was a person, not an animal. They were watching the cabin, watching me. I waited until almost sunrise before I opened the door and stepped outside with the axe. The shape was gone. Nothing by the woodpile. No tracks, no sign. But the shirt was back, folded, placed on the porch step. I left the next day. I packed up everything before noon and loaded the car fast. I didn't care if I wasted the rest of the rental money. I didn't care if I left food behind. I didn't even look back at the cabin. I didn't want to know if someone was standing at the edge of the woods watching me. I didn't want to see. The road out felt longer than it had before. Every curve in the gravel made me glance in the mirrors. Every time I saw a shape in the trees, my heart jumped. I only stopped when I hit the main highway. I didn't even check my phone until I was over 30 miles away. When I finally got signal, I checked the listing for the cabin. It was gone. The host's profile didn't exist anymore. The photos were gone. The address wasn't listed anywhere. I searched the county land records and couldn't find anything that matched the location. I tried to retrace the route on satellite maps. Nothing showed up in that part of the forest. No clearings, no structures, just trees. I drove home in silence. I didn't play music. I didn't call anyone. I didn't sleep well for weeks. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. I still think about the shirt, the footprints, the scraping marks on the trees. I try to tell myself it was just a squatter or a drifter, someone hiding out. Maybe they thought I was invading their space. But then I remember how close they got to the cabin, how quiet they were, how careful. They didn't try to hurt me, but they didn't want me there. And now, whenever I go anywhere remote, no matter how peaceful it looks. Part of me always wonders who's already watching and waiting. I needed a break from everything. Work was draining me dry, and I'd started snapping at people over the smallest things. My sleep schedule was a mess, and my body felt like it was running on fumes. So, I took a week off, packed up some supplies, and rented a remote cabin deep in the forest of northern Idaho. It was tucked away in the middle of nowhere. No neighbors, no traffic, no cell signal. That was exactly what I wanted. Total silence, total isolation. The drive out there was long. I left the highway and followed dirt roads that got narrower the deeper I went. After about an hour on those uneven paths, I pulled up to a small wooden cabin surrounded by thick trees on all sides. The only clear area was a gravel patch out front where I parked. It wasn't fancy, just one main room with a bed, table, and wood stove, plus a tiny kitchen and a bathroom with a weak toilet and barely working sink. But it was quiet. No sound but the wind and the trees creaking. I unpacked, lit a fire, and started settling in. The first day passed peacefully. I read for hours and went on a short hike behind the cabin. The woods were thick and old. Fallen logs covered in moss. Trees packed so tightly the sunlight barely reached the forest floor. I found a small stream not far from the cabin and sat there for a while just listening to the water. It felt good to be away from the constant buzz of city life. That night I made some canned soup, wrote in a journal, and went to bed early. The fire in the stove kept the place warm, and the darkness outside felt almost comforting. The second day I explored a little farther. I followed the stream upstream and found some animal tracks along the bank. Deer maybe, or elk. I took a few photos and then turned back before it got too dark. On my way back, I noticed something strange. A tree near the path had deep gouges on its trunk. Not like claw marks, more like someone had hacked at it with a blade. But the cuts looked old, maybe made months ago. I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured someone else had been out there before me, maybe testing a hatchet or something. That night I had trouble sleeping. Not because of noise, there was none, but because it was too quiet. That kind of heavy silence that presses on your ears. I kept waking up, feeling like I'd heard something, but there was never anything there. Just the stove crackling and the wind outside. I got up once around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and noticed the fire had died down. I threw a couple more logs in, warmed up for a bit, then went back to bed. By the third day, the place started to feel different. Not scary, just strange. The woods were still and quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I'd walk out onto the porch and look around, and for no reason at all, I'd get this cold feeling in my stomach, like someone was nearby watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But then I noticed something else. Footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. I checked my boots and walked around a bit to compare. These were bigger, wider, and deeper than mine, like someone heavier had been walking around. I followed them a little ways into the trees before they just stopped. There were no more prints, no disturbed leaves, nothing. Just a sudden end. Creeped me out, but I tried to explain it away. Maybe they were old, and the wind or rain had erased the others. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I double-checked that I'd locked the door and windows before I went to bed that night. I kept the hatchet I'd brought with me, mainly for chopping wood, next to the bed. I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing faint noises outside, like twigs snapping, soft crunching sounds. Every time I got up to check, there was nothing out there, just darkness and cold air. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the trees, but it could have just been my tired eyes. On the fourth day, things started getting worse. I went out early in the morning to grab some firewood I'd stacked on the side of the cabin, and I saw something strange. The pile was messed up, like someone had kicked it around. A few logs were missing, and one was snapped clean in half. I hadn't touched it since the day I arrived. I walked around the area, looking for prints, but found nothing clear. Just broken branches and disturbed dirt. It felt deliberate. That day, I didn't go hiking. I stayed near the cabin, keeping an eye on the woods. Couldn't relax. Every sound made me jump, Every gust of wind had me looking over my shoulder. I tried reading, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the footprints, the firewood, the quiet noises at night. I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see someone or something standing in the trees, but the forest stayed still. That night, I barely slept at all. I lay in bed with the hatchet next to me, staring at the dark ceiling. Around midnight, I heard it again, movement outside. Not just a single sound, but a slow, steady pacing around the cabin. Crunching leaves, creaking boards, then a soft tap on the wall. I sat up, heart pounding, trying not to breathe too loud. Another tap, then silence. I didn't move until the sun came up. In the morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the side of the cabin where I'd heard the tapping, there were fresh marks on the wood, like someone had scraped a sharp object down the surface. Not deep, but fresh. I could still see bits of the wood dust on the ground. I packed my stuff right then. I didn't care if I still had days left on the rental. I was done. I started driving out, back down the long dirt road. Felt like it took forever. Every time I saw movement in the trees, I tightened my grip on the wheel. I didn't stop once. When I finally reached the highway, I felt like I could breathe again. I drove straight home, didn't even stop for food. When I got back to my apartment, I locked every door and checked every window. I never found out who or what had been near the cabin. I didn't call the cops because what would I tell them? That I heard noises and saw footprints? They wouldn't have done anything. I tried to forget about it, but some nights I still hear those slow, careful steps circling my place, like someone walking just out of sight. I haven't gone back to the woods since, and I don't think I ever will. I never imagined I would end up spending the worst weekend of my life in a cabin I thought was going to be my peaceful escape from the city. It all started about 6 months ago. I had been dealing with stress from work, long commutes, and city noise for years. Everything from honking cars to people yelling outside at night just wore me down. I wanted out. I didn't want to hear neighbors through the walls. I didn't want to deal with anything but trees, wind, and silence. So when I saw a small listing for a cabin in northern Idaho pop up on one of those lesser-known property websites, I was intrigued. The price was shockingly low. It was just under $30,000 for the land and the structure. Off-grid, but apparently livable. Pictures showed a basic A-frame cabin with a small porch, a loft, and a wood-burning stove inside. No one had lived in it for years. The previous owner had died, apparently of natural causes, and the family just wanted to get rid of it. That's what the listing said. Anyway, I don't know what possessed me, but I bought it within 2 weeks. I had been saving money for years, and this place seemed like the perfect side project. I imagined myself spending quiet weekends there, fixing it up slowly, reading books by the fire, taking hikes through the forest, maybe fishing at the lake 2 miles down the gravel road. I thought I was going to be happy. The first time I visited was in April. Snow had melted, and the air was crisp. I made the drive from Boise, packed up with groceries, tools, and a portable generator. It took me about 6 hours to reach the small town nearest the cabin. From there, I drove nearly 45 minutes up a winding dirt road, barely wide enough for one car. The road passed through tall pine trees and hills with loose rocks. There were no signs, no cell phone signal, just the GPS I had downloaded offline. The cabin was isolated. I mean, really isolated. No neighbors within sight. Trees surrounded the place like a wall. The roof was a bit rusted, but the walls were solid. Inside, it was dusty, but it looked just like the pictures. There was a small kitchen area with a busted sink, a simple wooden table, and a ladder that led up to the loft where a mattress still sat on the wooden floor. That first visit was peaceful. I stayed for a night. Nothing strange happened. I cleaned the inside, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and took inventory of what I'd need to replace or fix. I left early the next morning because I had work on Monday, but the place stayed in my head for weeks afterward. I couldn't wait to go back. Fast forward to late June. I had a 4-day weekend coming up. I decided I'd go to the cabin, fully prepared this time. I bought more supplies, canned food, a new hatchet, extra batteries, a solar power bank for my phone, even though I didn't expect service, a new propane stove, and a good quality lantern. I wanted to camp in comfort. I left at dawn and got there around 2 p.m. The air felt warmer, and the trees looked greener. As I pulled up to the cabin, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. I remembered clearly locking it the last time. I stopped the car and just sat there for a minute, staring at the door. I felt uneasy, but I told myself maybe I had locked it wrong or the wind had blown it open somehow. I got out, grabbed my backpack, and walked up to the porch. I pushed the door open slowly. The inside looked about the same, dusty, dark, but untouched. I checked the cabinets, the loft, under the table. Everything was there. I didn't see any signs of break-in. No footprints, no trash, no animals. The only weird thing was a faint, sour smell I hadn't noticed before. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just old wood or something dead in the walls. I dropped my bags and started unpacking. I opened the windows again, lit a candle to help with the smell, and sat outside for a while. By sunset, I had eaten a can of chili, organized my tools, and chopped a small pile of wood for the stove. It felt good to work with my hands. The sun dipped behind the trees, and the temperature dropped fast. I went inside, lit the stove, and read from a paperback I brought with me. That night, I climbed up into the loft and lay down on the mattress. I heard wind outside and the occasional sound of wood creaking. That was expected. Old places make noise. I drifted off pretty quickly, but then I woke up around 3 in the morning. There was no reason, no dream, no loud noise. I just opened my eyes and felt a tightness in my chest. I was sweating. The fire downstairs had gone out. The air was cold. I could see my breath faintly in the dark. But that wasn't what bothered me. It was the silence. I mean, pure, dead silence. I had never experienced anything like it. No wind, no animals, not even the ticking of the old stove's metal as it cooled down. I strained my ears for any sound and felt this strange pressure in my head, like I was underwater. I sat up, heart pounding, and peeked down the loft opening. Nothing, just darkness and shadows. I turned on my flashlight and climbed down. The inside was quiet, untouched. I walked to the front door and opened it. Cold air hit me in the face. I stepped outside barefoot. Still nothing. No movement. No breeze. Not even insects. I stood there for about a minute, just listening. That's when I noticed something off to the right, about 20 feet into the trees. A branch was broken, hanging oddly. It wasn't like that before. I had looked at those trees earlier that day when I stacked the firewood nearby. I knew what that spot looked like. Something had snapped it recently. I held my flashlight up, shining it toward the tree. The light didn't reach that far. I stared into the dark for a long time, barely breathing. Eventually, I backed inside, locked the door, and pushed the table against it. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. Told myself I was just paranoid. Maybe a deer had walked through. Maybe I was just overthinking it because I was alone. But that second night, things got worse. It started with noises. Just after sundown, I heard crunching outside, like footsteps. Not constant, just a step or two, then silence. Then another step, always in short bursts. It went on for almost an hour. I kept the lantern off and sat in the loft, peeking through a small hole in the wooden wall. I saw something move between the trees. Not an animal. I know what deer look like. This was taller. It stood upright. The outline was just enough to see a shoulder or an arm. It didn't have a flashlight and it didn't speak. It just stood there behind a tree. I stayed in that loft all night. I didn't even move. The steps came and went. At one point, I heard something brush against the wall outside, slow like a hand. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I went outside with the hatchet and checked the perimeter. I found prints in the dirt behind the cabin. Boots, adult-sized, too big to be mine. They came from the woods and stopped just outside the cabin. No return tracks, just a single approach. That's when I really started to panic. I wanted to leave, but the road was narrow, and I didn't want to drive down it in a rush. I didn't know if someone was hiding in the trees or following me, so I stayed one more night. I thought I'd wait till morning, pack everything, and leave calmly. That was a mistake. The final night, I barely even turned on my lantern. I ate a granola bar and sat with the hatchet in my lap. Around 10 p.m., I heard tapping. Not on the door, on the side of the cabin, like fingers knocking gently, then a pause, then again. I stood still, trying not to make noise. Then it moved. The tapping shifted to the back wall, then to the other side, like someone circling. I climbed up into the loft slowly and watched through the cracks. It was dark, but the moon gave just enough light to catch movement. There was a man. No flashlight, no backpack, just standing in the trees, wearing dark clothes. He wasn't holding a weapon that I could see. He just stood there, looking at the cabin. I watched him for what felt like hours. He never moved. Eventually, sometime after midnight, he was gone. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed everything in 15 minutes, grabbed my bag, and got in the car. The road felt longer driving out. Every turn made me think someone might be waiting. I didn't relax until I hit pavement again and saw a gas station with cars and people. When I got back to the city, I reported it. The county sheriff's office said they'd send someone to check. They called me a week later. They didn't find anyone. No sign of break-in, just boot prints outside, like I said. They asked if I wanted to press charges, but there was nothing to press. I didn't see a face. I didn't have proof. I haven't gone back since. The cabin is still mine. The keys are in a drawer in my apartment. Sometimes I dream about it. The man in the woods, the silence, the tapping on the walls. The thing that bothers me most isn't what happened while I was there. It's wondering how long he had been watching me before I ever saw him. I've been needing a break for a long time. My job had worn me out, mentally more than anything. Day after day behind a desk, late hours, the same city noise, the same tight schedule. I'd been living in a bubble of emails, screens, and traffic. I was 35, single, and too used to routines that left me drained. When I finally decided to take time off, I didn't tell anyone. I just booked a remote cabin and drove out alone. It was early November, not yet full winter, but most people weren't taking trips to the mountains. That was what I liked about it. Fewer people, quieter. The cold didn't bother me much anyway. I'd found the listing online, a small one-room cabin near the edge of a national forest in Colorado. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors for miles. It was old but maintained, and the owner had warned me that the road up there could get muddy if it rained. That didn't bother me either. I wasn't planning on going anywhere once I got there. I wanted to unplug completely. The drive took about 9 hours. The last 2 were on narrow roads, with long stretches where I didn't see another car. By the time I pulled into the dirt clearing near the cabin, the sun was just starting to dip. The place looked even more isolated than I expected. One wooden structure, a porch, a rusted metal shed off to the side. Behind the cabin, the woods stretched out endlessly. The trees were tall, thin, and dark. Pine mostly. Everything smelled like cold bark and damp earth. Inside the cabin, it was simple. One main room with a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchenette, a twin bed against the wall, and a narrow table. There was a closet near the door and a bathroom on the side with an old shower stall and a toilet that flushed weekly. No TV, no radio, just silence. I unpacked my food, some books, and a sleeping bag. The stove worked fine after I got the fire going, and I heated up a can of chili for dinner. I didn't realize how quiet it really was until I lay down for the night. The silence out there wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, the kind that makes your ears ring. I fell asleep early, but I kept waking up. I wasn't scared exactly, just too used to noise. Every little creak from the cabin made me sit up and listen. The wood popped as it settled in the cold. Something small, probably a raccoon, scratched around under the porch. At one point, I thought I heard leaves crunching outside, but when I got up and looked through the window, there was nothing. The next day was better. I hiked a little, cooked on the fire, took photos. I didn't see another soul the entire day. I liked that. Around late afternoon, clouds started to roll in. The air smelled like wet rock and frozen moss. Just after sunset, it started to rain lightly. The wind picked up, and I could hear it whistle through the trees. I didn't mind. I was warm inside. I had a good fire, a heavy blanket, and a small LED lantern that ran on batteries. The rain tapped on the roof like fingers. I went to bed around 10. Around midnight, I woke up again. I didn't know why at first. There wasn't a sound that I could remember hearing. I just opened my eyes, and something felt off. I stayed still and listened. The wind had died down. The rain had stopped. The fire had gone out in the stove, and the inside of the cabin was colder. My breath fogged slightly in front of my face. Then I heard it. A light thump from the back of the cabin. Then another. Not loud. Just the kind of sound wood makes when something bumps against it. Not an animal. Too heavy. Too slow. I sat up quietly. I couldn't see much in the dark. Just the outline of the window. I reached for the flashlight and clicked it on, but I kept it pointed low. I didn't want to make myself a spotlight. I waited. A few minutes passed. Nothing else. I got up and walked slowly to the window. I looked out into the back. The trees were barely visible, just tall black lines in the dark. I didn't see anything. No movement. No shape. I stood there for another 5 minutes, maybe more. Still nothing. I went back to bed and left the flashlight within reach. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. There were footprints behind it. Not animal prints, boot prints. The ground was wet from the rain, and the prints were clear. They came from the woods and stopped near the back wall. Then they turned and went back into the trees. My stomach dropped. I stood there, looking at them, trying to figure out how big they were, how fresh. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked out there since I arrived. They were new. They weren't there the day before. That much I was sure of. I looked around. Nothing else seemed disturbed. I walked into the trees for a bit, following the direction the prints had gone. They disappeared fast in the underbrush. I went back to the cabin, locked the door, and sat inside for a long time. I kept telling myself it could have been a hunter or a lost hiker. Someone passing through, just checking out the cabin. Maybe they didn't even know I was inside. I almost left that day, but I didn't. I come out here to get away. I didn't want to panic over nothing. I stayed close to the cabin, didn't hike, didn't relax much either. I kept the hatchet from the shed next to the bed that night. Nothing happened for 2 days. It snowed a little the third morning. I hadn't seen a car on the main road since I got there. I hadn't heard a plane, hadn't heard a voice. That third night, it all fell apart. I was lying in bed again, the fire low, but enough to keep the room warm. I'd been dozing off when I heard the door handle move. Just a rattle. Soft. Then again. Then it stopped. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would shake the mattress. I waited. I heard the sound of boots on the porch. Then silence. I didn't move for at least 10 minutes. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the door. Nothing. I got up slowly and moved toward the window, looked out through the curtain. There was someone standing just at the edge of the woods, near the shed. I saw the outline of their body, just barely, against the snow. They weren't moving. They were just standing there, facing the cabin. I backed away from the window and turned off the light. I stood in the dark, holding the flashlight in one hand and the hatchet in the other. I couldn't see them anymore. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I opened the door carefully. There were boot prints again, fresh. This time, they came up to the porch. I followed them with my eyes. They went to the shed. I hadn't checked the shed since the first day. The door wasn't locked, just latched with an old rusty hook. I opened it slowly. The shed was empty, or at least it looked empty at first. Then I saw the corner. Someone had been staying there. There were food wrappers, a sleeping bag, a pile of clothes, a small propane heater, footprints in the dirt floor. I felt sick. Someone had been camping in the shed. While I was inside the cabin, I walked backward, slowly. I locked the cabin door, pushed the table in front of it, and packed my things. I left within the hour, drove the entire 9 hours back without stopping. I didn't care if the road was bad. I didn't care if I'd paid for the full week. I just wanted out. I never reported it. I didn't know who it was, what they wanted. They hadn't broken in. They hadn't said anything. Maybe they were homeless. Maybe hiding. Maybe worse. What still keeps me up at night is thinking about how long they were watching. If they were there when I arrived. If they saw me unpack. If they waited for me to fall asleep. I still have the photos I took the first day. The trees, the porch, the sky before the rain. They look peaceful. You wouldn't guess what happened there. But I don't go on solo trips anymore. And I never book cabins that remote. Ever again. I had been working from home for almost 2 years straight. Everything had blended together, days, weeks, meals, phone calls, errands. It all felt the same. I needed a break from people, traffic, phones, and screens. I needed silence. I thought about leaving the city for a week or two and going somewhere completely isolated. I wasn't thinking about a vacation. I wanted somewhere quiet, private, and far away, just to focus and work without distractions. I had some personal writing to do, a few documents to finish, and I just wanted to get it done in peace. I found this cabin on a rental website. It was deep in the northern woods, about 4 hours away from the nearest real town. The listing said it had a generator, running water, and even weak satellite internet. But most importantly, it promised full isolation, no neighbors for miles in any direction. It wasn't one of those modern fancy cabins either. It looked old, worn out, and barely maintained, but that was fine by me. I wanted something simple. I booked it for 2 weeks. The drive up was long and quiet. After the highway, I had to take this bumpy dirt road for almost an hour. I passed thick trees and rocky hills the whole time. There were no signs, no gas stations, not even fences. Eventually, I reached this narrow gravel path that led to the cabin. You couldn't see it from the road. I had to drive slowly because of the overgrown brush. It was hidden deep in the woods, behind some tall trees and mossy boulders. When I parked, I just sat in the car for a minute, looking around. It was totally silent. No wind, no traffic, not even birds at that moment. Just stillness. The cabin looked even older in person. The wood was gray and weathered. The roof was sagging a little, but it looked solid enough to stay in. The porch creaked when I stepped onto it. Inside was simple, just a wooden floor, a small bed, a little kitchen area with a propane stove, and a desk near the window. The air smelled like dust and old pine. There was a door in the back that led to a small outhouse, about 20 yards away from the cabin. I unpacked and tried to settle in. That first day, I didn't do much. I made a simple dinner with the food I brought, walked around the area a little, and read for a bit. That night, it got cold, and I heard strange creaks and pops as the cabin cooled down. I reminded myself it was just the wood shifting. No big deal. The first few days were peaceful. I kept to a routine. I'd wake up early, make breakfast, and work from 8 to noon. Then I'd stretch, make lunch, and keep working till around 5. After that, I'd relax or walk the perimeter a little just to get fresh air. There was a little stream about 15 minutes downhill, and I'd sometimes go sit by it. But by the 4th night, I started to feel watched. That's the only way I can put it. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. But every time I stepped outside, I felt it. Like someone was standing behind a tree or just beyond the brush, waiting. It was strongest near the outhouse, especially at night. I kept turning around suddenly, but nothing was there. I told myself it was just nerves. Being alone in the woods can mess with your head. Then, one night, I left a small folding chair out by the porch. I always brought it back in before bed, but that night I forgot. In the morning, the chair was gone. At first, I thought maybe the wind blew it away, but it wasn't that light and the wind had been calm. I walked around and found it almost 50 feet away, placed neatly against a tree. Not tossed or broken, just standing there like someone had moved it intentionally. That was the first moment I felt truly uneasy. I brushed it off and got back to work, but something had shifted in my mind. I started checking the windows more often. I kept the curtains closed now. I double-checked the locks at night, even though the door had just one latch. And every time I used the outhouse, I did it quickly, keeping my head on a swivel. I started hearing soft cracking sounds in the woods at night. Not loud, not constant, just one or two, like footsteps on leaves or a twig snapping under weight. One morning, around day 6, I found footprints in the dirt. They were faint but definitely there. Not mine. I had boots with deep tread. These were more like sneakers or worn-out shoes, smaller than mine. They circled the cabin. I froze when I saw them. I didn't know if they were fresh, but they hadn't been there the day before. I walked the whole area to look for other tracks, but they disappeared into the woods. That's when I started keeping a kitchen knife on me. I even started sleeping with it under the bed. I thought about leaving early, but I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe someone got lost and wandered through. But then I remembered how deep I was. There were no trails, no campsites. This wasn't a place you just wander into. On day 7, I went down to the stream in the morning like I sometimes did. It was foggy, and the trees were wet from an early mist. When I got back to the cabin, something felt wrong immediately. The door was closed, but the latch looked slightly crooked. I hadn't noticed it before. I opened the door slowly, holding the knife in one hand. Nothing looked stolen. My stuff was all there, but something on the desk caught my eye. A pen that had been sitting neatly in the cup was now lying across my notebook. It was a tiny thing, but I knew I hadn't left it that way. I started checking everything. My bag, my drawers, the corners of the room. I didn't find anything missing. But later that night, when I laid down, I noticed the pillow had a faint smell of sweat that wasn't mine. It was subtle, but it was there. Someone had been inside. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up with the knife in my hand, watching the window. I thought about calling someone, but I had no cell signal, and the satellite internet barely worked during storms. And it had rained earlier that day. I couldn't get any signal out. Around 2 a.m., I heard soft footsteps on the porch. Not animals, not raccoons or deer. Human weight. Steady, slow steps. They stopped right in front of the door. I held my breath. My heart was hammering so loud I thought whoever was out there could hear it. I waited for a knock, or the sound of someone trying the latch. But nothing came. No sound. Just silence. I didn't move for nearly an hour. By dawn, the sound never came again. When I finally stepped out to check, I saw the porch floor had wet marks. Faint boot prints. They didn't go anywhere. Just walked up to the door and back off the porch into the woods. That was it. I packed my stuff in 15 minutes. I didn't even eat. I threw everything into the car and left without looking back. I drove faster than I should have on the gravel road, swerving around rocks and over branches. I didn't stop until I got to the highway. It's been months since I left that cabin, but I still remember every sound from those woods. I looked back at the listing a few weeks later. It was removed. No trace of it. No rental page. No contact information. Nothing. I tried looking up the area on satellite maps. It didn't show any cabins in that exact spot. Just trees and dirt roads. I never found out who was living out there, or watching me, or sleeping in that cabin when I left. But I know for a fact it wasn't just some hiker. Whoever it was, they were staying close, staying quiet, and watching everything I did. Waiting. And what scares me the most is how easily they could have come in while I slept. Maybe they did. Maybe more than once. I still think about that chair by the tree, the footprints, the smell of someone else's sweat on my pillow, the pen across the notebook. Tiny signs. That's how it started. And if I had stayed longer, I think it would have ended very differently. It started as a break from everything. I had been working long hours for months with no real rest, and I needed to get away from the city, the noise, the people, and even my phone. I wanted complete silence and space to think. So I booked a small cabin in northern Maine, tucked deep into the woods and far from any paved road or major town. It looked cozy in the pictures, just one room with stove, small kitchenette, a cot, and a tiny front porch. I didn't need much. I just needed quiet. I got there in early November. The air had that dry coldness that stung the nose and cheeks, and most of the trees had already shed their leaves. The drive up was long, about 7 hours from where I lived, and the last 2 hours were all dirt roads, rough and uneven. There was no one around. I passed maybe one other car, and even that was an old pickup truck heading in the opposite direction. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was starting to set. It sat alone near a small lake, surrounded by bare trees. The water was still, almost glass-like, and the whole area felt frozen in time. I parked next to the woodpile and unloaded what I needed: clothes, food, some books, a sleeping bag, flashlight, and a few other essentials. There was no power, but I had a lantern and a solar-powered charger for my phone, though I doubted there'd be any signal out here. The first night was peaceful. I lit a fire in the wood stove and cooked some canned soup over a small portable burner. The wind blew gently through the trees outside, and the crackling fire was the only sound inside. It was exactly what I needed. I fell asleep early, bundled up in my sleeping bag with the fire dying down to embers. The next few days followed a calm routine. I'd wake up with the sun, make coffee over the burner, eat a simple breakfast, and go for long walks in the woods. I didn't stray too far from the cabin since there were no trails and it was easy to lose your sense of direction. I marked some trees with little pieces of string just in case. I spent the afternoons reading and writing in my journal. The nights were colder than I expected, but the stove kept things warm enough. I didn't see another person the entire time. It was on the 5th night that something changed. I was out on the porch just before sunset, drinking the last bit of coffee from my thermos, when I noticed something that made me pause. Across the lake, beyond the tree line, I saw movement. Just a flicker, but enough to catch my attention. It looked like someone walking, slow and steady, between the trees, but I couldn't make out much, just a shape. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but by then it was gone. I waited a while, scanning the tree line, but nothing else moved. It was probably just an animal, maybe a deer. Still, I went back inside and locked the door. That night, I didn't sleep as easily. I kept waking up to every creak and snap from the woods outside. I told myself it was nothing, just the usual forest sounds I wasn't used to. The next morning, I walked around the lake. It was a decent hike, but I wanted to check out where I saw the movement. The ground was covered in a layer of frosted leaves and soft moss. I didn't find any footprints, but I did come across something odd. What looked like a piece of cloth caught on a branch. It was dark green, almost black, and about the size of a shirt sleeve. It looked fairly new, not like it had been there long. That made me uneasy. Someone had been out here. Maybe they were hiking, maybe hunting, but I hadn't seen or heard anyone. And the area wasn't known for having trails or campsites. When I got back to the cabin, I checked my phone for signal again. Nothing. I left it on the windowsill just in case it caught anything. I didn't have a gun with me, but I had a small hatchet and a long hunting knife I brought for general utility. That night, I slept with both next to me. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. Everything was quiet. The fire had burned down low, just glowing coals. I listened for a while, and that's when I heard it. A soft crunching outside. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They were coming from the side of the cabin. My heart started to pound. I stayed completely still, straining my ears. The steps moved around to the front. Then I heard the faint creak of the front porch. I grabbed the hatchet and crept to the window next to the door. I didn't turn on any light. I just peeked through the curtain. The porch was empty, but I knew I heard something. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I waited for over an hour, sitting in the dark, before I finally laid back down. But I didn't sleep. The next day, I found footprints, clear ones, right on the frost-covered ground. They led from the woods to the front porch, then back again, disappearing into the trees. They weren't mine. I had worn hiking boots. These were different, flatter, like sneakers or soft-soled shoes. No treads. That changed everything. I wasn't alone. I packed some of my stuff that day and moved my cot closer to the door. I kept the hatchet under my sleeping bag and the knife within arm's reach. That night, I didn't use the lantern. I sat in darkness. Around midnight, the sounds came back. But this time, it was more than footsteps. I heard light tapping on the side of the cabin. Not constant, just a few taps, spaced out. then nothing, then a few more, like someone testing the walls. Then I heard the soft creak of the porch again, and then breathing. It was faint, but I swear I heard it. Slow breathing just outside the door. I sat frozen for what felt like hours. Eventually, the sounds stopped again, but I didn't move until morning light started creeping through the cracks in the walls. I opened the door the next morning. Nothing was there, but more footprints. More of that same soft-soled print, circling the cabin now. I needed to leave. I packed everything, but when I got to the car, my stomach dropped. The front driver's side tire was slashed. Not punctured from a rock or branch. Slashed clean and deliberate. And not just that one. The passenger side rear tire was also done. I stood there staring, trying to calm myself down. I still had 2 good tires, but I wasn't sure how far I could drive on them, especially on those rocky back roads. I made a decision. I wasn't going to stay another night. I loaded my gear and drove slowly, carefully, making it about 10 miles before the rear tire gave out. The car sagged hard on that side, and I had to stop. I was still deep in the woods. No houses, no signs of life. I locked the car and grabbed my backpack, hatchet, and knife. I started walking. I walked for hours. The sun was starting to dip again when I finally reached a road with real pavement. Not long after, I flagged down a passing truck. The driver was an older man, kind, and after hearing what happened, he drove me straight to the nearest sheriff's station. I told them everything. They sent a deputy to check the cabin and my car. When they got back, they told me there were more footprints, more signs of someone living out there. They never found the person, but they did find more cut cloth, signs of a small fire pit near the lake, and a tree carved with strange symbols. Nothing occult, just markings like someone had been counting days. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked for a refund. I didn't want anything to do with it. Sometimes I still think about it, about whoever was out there watching me. I think they had been living there longer than I had, maybe even before I arrived. Maybe they thought I was intruding, or maybe they just wanted to scare me. I don't know, but I do know this. I trusted the silence out there too quickly. I let my guard down, and if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have left at all. That trip changed how I see isolation. It's not always peaceful. Sometimes it's where danger hides best. And now, no matter where I go, I always check the woods twice. I always sleep with one ear open, and I never, ever assume I'm alone. I wasn't supposed to be up there alone. That was never the plan. My cousin Mark was supposed to drive up with me, but his girlfriend got sick the night before, so he stayed back. I had already taken the week off work and packed the truck with supplies, so I decided to go anyway. I figured a week away from everything, no phone signal, no internet, no traffic, just trees and air, would be good for me. I thought I needed it. I still don't know if that was true. The cabin was one we had been to before. My uncle owned it, and he let us use it from time to time. It was a small place near the edge of the forest in northern Idaho, built back in the 70s. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, no electricity except for a generator that didn't always work, and a propane stove and heater. It wasn't luxury, but it was warm, dry, and quiet. That's what I wanted. I got there just after noon. The dirt road that leads to it had been rutted from rain, and my truck almost got stuck once, but I made it. Everything looked the same as I remembered. The wooden deck out front had a few new cracks. The window on the east side had a piece of plywood nailed over it from some storm damage, I guessed. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale and dry, a couple of dead flies on the windowsill. I dropped my bag and walked through the cabin, checking every corner out of habit. Once I had unpacked, I fired up the generator out back. Started, though it made a weird rattling sound that I hadn't heard before. I decided to only use it for a couple hours in the evenings, just enough to keep my phone charged in case I wanted to take photos or use the flashlight. There was no signal anyway. The first night was peaceful. I read a book on the couch for a while, then made a can of chili and some instant mashed potatoes. I sat on the steps of the deck, watching the woods go dark. Everything slowed down out there. No lights from other houses, no cars, just trees and the sound of wind. I slept better than I had in weeks. The second day, I spent chopping some firewood and walking the trail behind the cabin. It loops around through the forest and comes back out near a dry creek bed. I saw some deer tracks and what might have been a cougar print. I had my hunting knife on me, just in case. It wasn't uncommon to spot a mountain lion in the area. I stayed alert. That night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just a branch tapping against the siding. Then I heard a sharp, short noise, like something scraping metal. I sat up in bed and held my breath. The heater had clicked off a while ago, and the cabin was cold and silent. I waited. Nothing else came. I told myself it was just the generator settling or some animal nosing around. It took me a while to fall back asleep. By the third day, I was starting to notice little things. Not big things, just odd details. I kept the cabin clean, but I found a wet spot near the back door that I didn't remember stepping in. There was a faint smell in the bathroom, like old water, even though the plumbing hadn't been used much. I heard something shift in the woods while I was splitting logs, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to being alone, being on edge. That evening, I locked the doors before the sun even went down. I didn't usually do that, but something about the stillness outside made me uneasy. I ate dinner quickly, cleaned up, and turned the generator off early. I sat in bed with my headlamp on, listening to the wind. That scraping sound came back. It was slow, rhythmic, metal on wood. I froze. It was close, just outside the wall. My heart was beating so hard it made my chest hurt. I waited, holding the knife in my hand, until it stopped. Maybe 10 minutes. I never saw anything. I told myself it could have been a raccoon or something larger brushing against the grill out back. Maybe the wind had blown a tree branch against the metal trash can. That made enough sense to keep me from losing it. Still, I barely slept. On the fourth day, I went to check the trash can behind the cabin. It had been moved a few feet. There were long, muddy smears on the side, like it had been dragged. No claw marks, just pressure. No footprints either, not that I could see. The ground was dry. The lid was off, but nothing had been taken. Not even the bag inside. I put the lid back and pushed the can into the corner by the wall. I tried not to think about it. That afternoon, I decided to walk further down the trail, past the dry creek bed. I needed to clear my head. I took my knife and a small backpack with some water. It was quiet out there, too quiet. I didn't hear birds or see squirrels, just wind again and the occasional creak of tree trunks shifting. I walked about a mile and turned back. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something immediately. One of the folding chairs that had been on the deck was now lying in the dirt off to the side. It looked like it had been kicked or thrown. I hadn't moved it. No one else should have been up there. I went inside and locked the door. I shut all the windows and sat on the couch for a long time, just listening. I didn't start the generator that night. I ate a protein bar instead of cooking. I kept the knife beside me. Around 1 a.m., the cabin creaked loud enough to wake me up. It was a sharp sound, like weight had shifted on the roof. I stayed still. Then came a softer sound, like someone walking on gravel. But the gravel path was 20 feet from the door. I couldn't see anything out the windows. It was pitch black. My flashlight only reached so far. I stayed like that until morning. When the sun came up, I opened the door slowly and looked around. Nothing, but the chair was gone. It wasn't just knocked over. It was gone. I walked the area around the cabin, scanning the trees. Nothing. No footprints. No drag marks. I walked the entire edge of the tree line. I saw a patch of disturbed dirt about 30 yards out, but it was just that, disturbed dirt. No tracks. No sign of an animal or person. I felt like I was being watched. I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I mean, I felt it in my neck, like someone standing behind you too close. I kept turning in circles as I walked back toward the cabin. Every sound made me flinch. That afternoon, I packed my things. I didn't care that I had planned to stay the whole week. I shoved my food, my clothes, everything into the truck. I walked through the cabin twice, making sure I wasn't leaving anything. As I went to shut off the propane valve behind the cabin, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. On the back wall, near the vent cover, were thin scratch marks. They weren't deep. They weren't wide. They were almost surgical, parallel, about 4 inches long and grouped in threes. They hadn't been there before. I started the truck and backed out of there faster than I should have. The road was rough and I scraped the bumper on a root, but I didn't stop. I didn't look in the mirrors. I just kept driving. I made it back to the main road by late afternoon. I stopped at a gas station 20 miles out to catch my breath. I used their bathroom and sat in the truck for 20 minutes, trying to convince myself I had just let the isolation get to me. Maybe it was some animals or a hunter passing through who got too close. Maybe the noises were old pipes or the generator groaning. But I didn't believe that. Not fully. When I got home, I unpacked everything and shoved it into the closet. I didn't even wash the clothes until a week later. I didn't talk to anyone about it. Not at first. Then Mark asked how the trip went, and I just told him it was quiet. About a month later, I got a call from my uncle. He asked if we had moved any furniture when we were up there. I said no. He sounded confused. He said when he went to check the place out, the kitchen table had been dragged into the corner and turned on its side, like someone used it as a barricade. One of the chairs had been jammed under the doorknob, and he found that same trash can on the roof. He asked if I had done it. I told him no. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Okay," and hung up. I haven't been back, and I won't. Whatever was out there wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a ghost or anything like that. It was real. It was watching me. It was close. I don't know what it wanted, but I think it was getting closer each night. That cabin isn't a place to go and relax anymore. Not for me. I keep thinking about the scratches and how they were too high off the ground for an animal. I keep wondering what would have happened if I had stayed just one more night. It started as a trip to get away from everything, the city, the noise, the routine. I had been working nonstop for almost 2 years, barely taking a weekend off. So when I finally requested 2 weeks off, I promised myself I wouldn't spend it on the couch or scrolling my phone. I wanted solitude, nature, and quiet. I wanted to be away from people. I found a listing for a remote cabin in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, near Lake Gogebic, about 5 hours north of where I lived. It wasn't fancy, but it was private. No neighbors, no traffic, and no cell service. That was the main selling point for me. I booked it for 12 nights and packed my gear like I was going on a long camping trip. I brought extra batteries, backup power banks, a small solar charger, tools, a hatchet, propane, dry food, canned goods, and even a satellite emergency beacon just in case. The road leading to the cabin was rough. Dirt and gravel, potholes everywhere, and so narrow that I had to pull over once to let another truck pass. The trees on either side formed a tunnel, and sunlight barely got through the canopy. I saw deer on the way, some wild turkeys, and a fox. No signs, no other cars. Felt like I was the only person around for miles. When I got to the cabin, I felt a deep sense of relief. It was a simple wood structure, maybe 30 feet by 20, one floor with a tiny deck out front. It had a tin roof and a stone chimney. The place was worn but clean. Inside there was one bedroom, a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and an old recliner by the window. No Wi-Fi, no TV, just peace. The first couple of days went exactly how I wanted. I went on hikes in the forest, cooked meals outside on a cast iron pan, and read old paperback books I had been putting off for years. I even started journaling. At night, the sounds of the woods were calming. Crickets, owls, and the occasional rustling of something small in the underbrush. I slept deeply. I stopped thinking about emails, deadlines, and bills. But around the fourth night, something started to feel wrong. Not anything obvious. It was just a creeping sense. I started waking up in the middle of the night, not because of a sound, but because of a feeling. Like something had changed around me, but I couldn't explain it. I'd lie there in the dark and listen to the silence. That was what bothered me, the silence. The usual night noises seemed to stop entirely. On the fifth morning, I woke up early, just before dawn. I stepped out onto the porch with a mug of instant coffee and saw something strange in the clearing that surrounded the cabin. In the middle of the tall grass, maybe 30 yards out, something looked off. It was a circle where the grass was bent down, flattened. It was about 6 feet across. I thought maybe a deer had bedded down there, but it looked too precise. Perfect ring. I walked out and checked it, but there were no tracks around it, just the flattened grass. I didn't know what to make of it, so I left it alone. That afternoon, I hiked further than I had before, maybe 3 or 4 miles out. I didn't bring my phone, just a compass and a map I had bought from a gas station. I followed a dried-out creek bed and ended up in a spot where the forest got denser. There were broken branches, claw marks on trees, and a strange smell in the air. It wasn't animal droppings, it was more like iron or wet metal. I started to feel uneasy, so I turned around and headed back. When I got to the cabin, I noticed something else odd. The propane canister I had left connected to the outdoor burner had been turned off. I knew for a fact I had left it open because I was boiling water before I left. Now it was shut tight. That spooked me. I checked the door, still locked. Windows were fine. Nothing inside looked touched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. That night I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me sit up. At one point I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I went to look, I saw nothing, just darkness and trees. The next day, I spent the whole morning checking around the cabin. I found no tracks, no damage, but when I walked out to the flattened circle in the grass, it was gone, like it had never been there. The grass stood tall again. I thought maybe I had imagined it, but I was sure I hadn't. I started locking the cabin door even during the day. I kept a hatchet near me at all times. I set up small tripwires using string and tin cans from my meals around the porch and near the path leading to the cabin. If anyone came near, I'd hear it. 3 nights later, the cans rattled. It was about 2 a.m. when I heard the first clinking sound. Not loud, just enough to jolt me awake. I stayed still and listened. A minute passed, then another, more rattling. A soft, slow clink. I slid out of bed, grabbed the hatchet, and crept toward the front window. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black. I hadn't left the porch light on. I waited, standing near the window, straining my ears. Then I heard what sounded like footsteps on the gravel just outside the porch. Not fast, not loud, just slow steps, crunching one at a time. Then silence. I stood there, barely breathing. 10 minutes passed. 20. Nothing. I didn't dare open the door. The next morning, I saw the string and cans on the right side of the path had been knocked over. One of them had rolled 10 feet away, but again, no tracks. The ground was soft, not muddy, but it should have shown something. A shoe print, a boot tread, anything. But there was nothing, like whoever or whatever was out there had floated. That day, I hiked back toward the main road. Took me almost 2 hours. I thought maybe I'd see another person or car, but I didn't. I left a note in a plastic bag near a trail marker I had passed earlier, just in case. I wrote the date, my name, and a short message. If anyone finds this, I'm staying in the cabin off Hollow Creek Trail. I think someone is messing with me. I went back to the cabin and started planning to leave early, but I still had 4 more nights booked, and a part of me didn't want to back out. I told myself maybe it was an animal, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I wanted to believe that, so I stayed. The next 2 nights were quiet. Nothing disturbed the tripwires. Nothing strange happened. I started to think it was over. On the 3rd night, the power bank I used for my lights died. I had forgotten to put it out in the sun to charge, so I used a lantern. That night, I heard tapping on the back window. It was faint, just 3 taps, then nothing. I froze. I had no back porch, just dense trees. No path, no reason for anyone to be back there. I didn't go look. I sat in the recliner, holding the hatchet, listening. I stayed like that until dawn. When the sun came up, I checked the window. No marks, no signs, just trees. That morning, I packed everything. I didn't care about the remaining 3 nights. I wanted out. I loaded my gear, checked every corner of the cabin twice, and locked the door behind me. As I drove out, I kept checking the mirror. About 5 minutes down the trail, I saw a shape behind the trees to my right. Person, standing still, watching. I stopped the car, backed up, looked again. Nothing, just trees. I left and never looked back. When I got home, I called the rental company, told them the place made me uncomfortable. They didn't ask questions, said I wasn't the first one to say that. It's been months now. I still think about that trip almost every night. I don't know if someone was stalking me, or if I wandered into something I wasn't supposed to see. But I know this, I was being watched. And whatever it was, it never made a sound. Since then, I haven't gone back into the woods alone. I still hike, but only in state parks on busy trails in daylight. I carry a GPS, and I always tell someone where I'm going. Somewhere out there, in that forest near Lake Gogibik, someone or something was waiting. And I'll never forget the feeling of those quiet footsteps in the dark, just beyond the door, because that silence wasn't empty. It was watching me. It started as a simple break from work. I had been feeling worn down for months. Too many emails, late nights, and early mornings. So I took 2 weeks off, booked a small, remote cabin in northern Montana through a listing online, and packed everything I thought I'd need. The idea was to be completely alone, away from the world, just hiking, reading, sleeping, and maybe doing some writing if the mood hit. It sounded perfect at the time. Peaceful, quiet. The drive to the cabin took most of the day. The last hour was rough. A dirt road that got narrower and more overgrown the deeper I went into the woods. I kept checking the directions twice, even though I downloaded them in advance because there was no cell signal out there. My GPS had gone dark a while back, and the road signs were either missing or so rusted you couldn't read them. It felt like the middle of nowhere, and that's exactly what I had signed up for. Still, a small part of me wondered if it was a little too far. I got to the cabin around 5 p.m. It was a small A-frame structure tucked into a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. The place looked decent from the outside. Aged wood, moss growing along the roof's edges, and a small porch with 2 chairs. There was a shed to the side that seemed locked up, and a chopped woodpile nearby. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine and earth. It was dead silent, not even the sound of birds or wind. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. One room with a bed in the corner, a wood stove, a small kitchenette with propane burners, a table and chair, and a narrow staircase leading to a small loft above. No running water, but there were jugs provided and a composting toilet out back. I was okay with that. I unpacked, started a small fire in the stove to take the edge off the chill, and made a simple dinner with some of the supplies I brought. That first night, I barely slept. Not because I was scared, just too quiet. No hum of a refrigerator, no cars passing by.
No distant dogs barking.
Just that thick silence. I kept waking up, thinking I'd heard something, but it was always nothing. Just trees shifting in the wind, maybe, or the fire popping in the stove. My body wasn't used to real silence, and it left me alert, restless. By day 2, I started to relax a little more. I took a short hike along a barely marked trail behind the cabin. I brought a map and compass with me just in case. The woods were thick and damp, full of fallen branches and undergrowth. I didn't see a single person or even hear a plane overhead. At some point, I sat on a log and just listened. Even the birds were scarce. It was strange. The weirdness started on day 3. I woke up to find the door of the cabin open. Not just unlocked, but wide open. I was sure I had shut it the night before. I even remembered latching it. There was no wind that night, and it wasn't the kind of latch that could just slip open on its own. I got up, walked to the doorway, and stepped outside. The forest looked the same. Nothing out of place. No footprints. But the ground was hard-packed dirt, and it hadn't rained, so I guess that wasn't surprising. I chalked it up to my own mistake. Maybe I had just forgotten. I closed the door, made coffee, and tried not to think too hard about it. But something felt different after that, like I wasn't entirely alone anymore. Later that afternoon, I heard something behind the cabin. A short, sharp sound, like a branch snapping. I froze inside. Didn't go outside right away. I waited. A full minute passed before I worked up the nerve to step around back. But again, nothing. Just trees. I looked at the shed. Still locked. I checked the lock to be sure. It was cold and solid. Still, I felt watched. By day 4, I had this low, gnawing anxiety in my gut. Like something was off, but I couldn't explain it. I tried going for another hike, but I couldn't focus. Every time a branch moved, I flinched. Every bird call felt like it echoed too much. I kept turning around, thinking someone might be there, watching, but it was always just trees. I didn't go far. I came back early. That night, it got worse. Around midnight, I heard something outside. Slow steps on the porch. Then one of the chairs creaked like someone sat in it. I didn't move. I was lying in bed under my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling in the dark. The fire had gone out. It was freezing, but I didn't dare get up. I just lay there listening, my heart pounding in my ears. Eventually, the sound stopped. No steps going away. No sound at all. I didn't sleep again that night. The first light, I stepped outside. The chair on the left side of the porch was turned slightly, like it had been moved. There was a smear of dirt on the wooden slats beneath it. I tried to tell myself it was probably an animal, but I knew better. An animal doesn't sit down in a chair. That day, I started keeping a knife on me at all times. Just a simple folding blade I used for cooking. I also found a piece of rebar in the shed. Turns out the lock was fake, the door just swollen from moisture and stuck shut. Inside was junk mostly. Old tools, some empty cans, wire, and a big rusted saw. On day 5, I saw the first clear sign that someone had been near the cabin. I was walking the trail again, hoping to clear my head, and about half a mile in, I found boot prints. Not mine. These were bigger and deeper. Someone had come in from the east, off trail, and crossed the path I was walking. I followed them for a short while, but they veered off into thicker woods. No idea where they led. I turned back fast. That night, I pushed one of the chairs under the door handle and jammed it tight. I kept the knife in my sleeping bag and barely blinked. Around 3 a.m., I heard the crunch of footsteps again. Not animals. Slow. Deliberate. Then it stopped right at the front wall of the cabin. I held my breath. Then I heard the doorknob jiggle. Softly, like someone testing it. Then silence. I stayed in bed, too scared to move. An hour later, when the sky just started to lighten, I got up and checked. The chair was still in place. The door hadn't opened, but there were muddy prints on the porch this time. Not boots, bare feet, human. On day 6, I decided to leave. I packed everything, got the fire out, checked the car. I was ready to go, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't even try to start. I opened the hood. I'm not a mechanic, but I know enough to see that someone had ripped wires out. Not chewed, not worn, ripped. Clean and deliberate. I stayed outside for a while, trying not to panic. I had no signal, no way to call for help. The nearest main road was miles away, and I didn't know if I'd even make it without a GPS. I thought about hiking out, but if someone was out there watching me, I didn't want to be alone in the woods without shelter. I decided to stay one more night and leave at first light. I locked the cabin as best I could, put a chair against the door again, set up some makeshift noise traps, cans and metal things on string outside the windows. I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight, I heard movement again, this time from the loft above. I was downstairs. There was only one way up to the loft, a narrow wooden staircase. I froze. I didn't breathe. The sound was soft like fabric dragging. A footstep, maybe. Slow. Careful. I stayed crouched behind the wood stove, holding the rebar. My knife was too far to reach. I didn't move for an hour. I don't even remember blinking. Then silence. No more sound from above. The first light, I bolted. I left everything. Just took my pack and the knife. I started walking. Fast. No food. No map. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. I walked for hours, heart pounding the whole time. Every twig snapping made me jump. I kept turning around. Around late afternoon, I finally reached a paved road. I waved down a passing truck. The driver looked at me like I was crazy, but he gave me a ride into town. I didn't explain much, just told him my car broke down and I needed a tow. Later, when I got a mechanic out there, he told me the car had been tampered with. Wires cut intentionally, deep cuts in the insulation, like someone knew what they were doing. The sheriff came out too. He walked through the cabin, asked some questions. I gave a report, but I could tell he thought I was just some city guy who got spooked. There was no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing to go on. He said it was probably a vagrant passing through, maybe a squatter. I never went back, left everything there, never filed for a refund. I just wanted to forget it. But some nights, when it's too quiet, I still think about that cabin, about the bare footprints on the porch, about the creak of that chair, about the sound in the loft when I was sure no one else had been inside. Could have ended much worse. I know that. I got lucky. I walked away, but I'll never be able to explain what really happened out there. And I don't want to try. I just know I'm never going that far off-grid again. Not alone. Not ever. It was early October when I took a week off work to get away from everything. I had been feeling burned out. Too much time in the city, too many people around me, too many meetings, noise, and screens. My head hurt constantly. I just needed to be away from all of it. So I decided to go to a cabin I found listed on a small website that offered off-grid stays in remote areas. The cabin was about 4 hours from the city, up in the hills near a place called Bramble Ridge. I had never heard of it before, and that was part of the appeal. The site said the cabin was remote, no electricity, no running water, but it had a wood stove, a creek nearby, and a basic outhouse. That was enough for me. I packed up everything I thought I would need for the week. Canned food, a camp stove, warm clothes, a headlamp, batteries, a good knife, a small axe, and my sleeping bag. I brought some books and a journal, thinking I would spend my time writing, hiking, and clearing my head. The drive out there was beautiful. The trees were turning orange and red, and once I turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt path, it was like entering a different world. The road twisted through the trees, climbing slowly into the hills. My phone signal dropped completely about 20 minutes in, which was fine by me. I kept going until I reached a small clearing with a sign nailed to a tree that read, North Creek Cabin 0.3 miles with an arrow. I parked my car on the side and followed the narrow path on foot. The cabin was small but solid. Weathered wood, a slanted roof, and a little porch. There was a small shed behind it with a stack of firewood, and down a small slope, I saw the creek running over smooth rocks. The sound of the water and the wind through the trees was the only thing I could hear. I stood there for a while, just taking in the silence. Inside, the cabin was simple. One room with a cot, a table and chair, a shelf with a few cooking tools, and the old wood stove. It smelled like smoke and pine. There was a small window above the table and another one on the opposite wall near the bed. I unpacked my things, put my food in a cooler I brought with ice packs, and started a small fire in the stove. The place warmed up fast. That first day passed quietly. I took a short walk along the creek, chopped some wood, and settled in. At night, I made soup, wrote a little in my journal, and went to bed early. It was dark out there, really dark. No streetlights, no neighbors, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the creek gurgling below. I fell asleep to that sound. The second day, I hiked a little farther up into the woods. There were old logging trails crisscrossing the hills, and I followed one that went up a ridge and gave me a great view of the valley below. I didn't see a single person the whole time. I liked it that way, but something strange happened that evening. I was sitting on the porch around sunset, sipping tea and watching the light fade through the trees. Just as it got dark enough that I needed my headlamp to see properly, I thought I heard something across the creek. It wasn't an animal sound, not like a deer or a squirrel. It was a thump, followed by another one, like something heavy dropping to the ground. I stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, shining my light toward the creek. I didn't see anything. I listened for a while, but the noise didn't come back. I figured it could have been a branch falling. Trees drop stuff all the time. I went back inside and didn't think much of it. But the next morning, I noticed something that felt off. About 20 yards from the cabin, near a tree by the path to the creek, the leaves were disturbed, like someone had walked around there recently. I had been down there the day before, but I didn't remember going that far off the path. There were faint prints too, but not clear enough to tell what kind. I tried not to let it bother me. Maybe a deer or something. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I read, I wrote, I made food. Around mid-afternoon, I was chopping more wood when I saw movement up on the ridge behind the cabin. I looked up and saw someone standing there, just for a second, before they stepped back behind a tree. It wasn't close, maybe 100 feet up the hill, but it was a person. I was sure of it. They were wearing dark clothes, and they moved too deliberately to be anything else. I stood there for a long time, staring up at the spot, but whoever it was didn't show again. I started to feel uneasy. I hadn't seen anyone since I got here. The listing said the cabin was on private land and there were no other rentals nearby. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing small noises outside. Not loud, just soft crunching sounds like someone walking very slowly through the leaves. I got up a few times and looked through the windows but didn't see anything. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just animals. But the next morning, I found something that changed everything. On the porch, right in front of the door, was a piece of string with 2 small twigs tied together in an X. It hadn't been there the night before. I stared at it for a long time. It didn't mean anything to me, but the fact that someone had been close enough to leave it without waking me up chilled me to the bone. I packed up my things. I told myself I was overreacting, but I still loaded everything into my backpack, just in case. I wasn't ready to leave yet, but I wanted to be able to if I had to. I spent most of that day inside the cabin with the door locked. I only stepped out to grab more firewood once. The feeling of being watched never left. I kept hearing the wind, the creak, the rustling trees, but under it all, I kept thinking I heard footsteps. Slow, careful ones. At sunset, I looked out the back window and saw something new. Up the hill, near where I had seen the figure the day before, was a piece of cloth hanging from a branch. It looked like a shirt sleeve, torn and faded. I had no idea how it got there. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of tapping. Light tapping, like someone tapping on the window glass with a fingernail. I froze. The sound came from the back window. Then it moved to the side window.
Top, top, top.
I grabbed my headlamp and shone it toward the window, but saw nothing. The tapping stopped. I didn't sleep again. I stayed awake, my axe beside me, until the sky started to lighten. When the sun came up, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed up the rest of my stuff, doused the stove, and locked the cabin behind me. The path back to the car felt longer than before. I kept turning around, checking the trees. When I reached the spot where I had parked, I froze. My car was there, but all 4 tires were slashed. Deep cuts, not animal damage. Someone had done it with a blade. I felt my stomach drop. I was miles from the nearest road. No signal. No one knew exactly where I was. I stood there trying to stay calm. I had food and water. I had my gear. I could hike out, but it would take most of the day. I looked at the road and decided to follow it, hoping to find a spot with cell signal or flag someone down. I walked for about an hour before I saw the first sign that something was wrong. A plastic bag hanging from a tree branch. Inside was a piece of paper with a smiley face drawn in marker. Just that, nothing else. I left it there. Farther down, maybe another hour later, I found a shoe. Just one. It was old and wet, lying on the side of the path. Then a few minutes after that, I found a scarf tied to a branch. All these things looked like they had been placed intentionally, like someone wanted me to see them. I kept walking. It was almost 3 p.m. when I finally saw a small house just off the road. It looked abandoned, but I went up and knocked anyway. No one answered. I tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the place was musty and dark. Broken furniture, cobwebs, trash. But what caught my attention was a map on the wall. A hand-drawn map of the area, with several locations marked in red ink. One of them was labeled North Creek, my cabin. There were other names I didn't recognize, all marked. There were tally marks next to each one. Mine had none yet. Some had 5, 6, 7. That's when I heard the engine, a vehicle coming down the road. I ran out, waving my arms, shouting. A forest ranger truck pulled up. The ranger looked confused at first, then concerned. I told him everything. He drove me to the nearest station, and I gave a full report. The police went to the cabin later that day. They found footprints. They found the shredded tires. They found the things I had described. But they didn't find anyone. I never found out who was out there, or why. I never found out who made that map or what the tallies meant. The cabin listing was removed a few days later. I haven't gone back into the woods since. I learned something out there, not about nature, not about peace or quiet or disconnecting. I learned that just because a place is beautiful and remote doesn't mean it's safe. Sometimes the silence hides something else, something that watches, waits, and walks just out of sight. I needed a break from everything. That's why I booked a cabin deep in the northern woods of Minnesota. My job had been sucking the life out of me for years, and I had just gone through a rough breakup that left me feeling like I didn't even know who I was anymore. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not because I was trying to hide, but because I didn't want the constant messages, the check-ins, or the fake sympathy. I wanted silence, trees, and time to breathe. I found the place on a website that listed off-grid cabins. It was listed as private writer's retreat, secluded, no neighbors, pure silence. The pictures showed a plain wooden structure surrounded by pine trees with a narrow dirt road leading to it. No power lines, no phone reception, just a propane stove, a wood stove for heat, and a hand-pumped well outside. That's what I wanted, something raw, the kind of isolation that forces your mind to settle. I left the city just after sunrise, packed with everything I thought I might need. Canned food, instant coffee, matches, warm clothes, and a printed map with the location of the cabin marked in red pen. The last stretch of the drive was a gravel road that narrowed until it felt more like a trail than a road. I kept checking the printed directions because the GPS had cut out about 30 miles earlier. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The place looked even more plain than it had in the pictures. No real charm to it, just a square wooden building with a small deck and 2 windows in front. There was a little metal chimney poking out of the roof, and a stack of chopped wood leaned against the wall. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, it was just as bare: 1 table, 1 chair, a cot, and a wood stove. That was it. The air was cold and smelled like pine and dust. I set my backpack down, opened the windows for a minute to let the stale air out, then closed them quickly to keep the cold from settling in. I made a small fire in the wood stove using the instructions the host had left on the table. Took longer than I thought it would, but eventually I got it going. The warmth was immediate, comforting. I didn't do much that night. Just unpacked, heated up a can of beans, and sat there listening to the wind through the trees. It was quiet, not the kind of quiet I was used to in the city. This was a heavy quiet, the kind that pressed down on your skin. The first night was fine. I woke up a couple times to the sound of creaking wood, but I reminded myself that old buildings do that. Wood shifts with temperature, animals move outside, things settle. Nothing unusual. The next morning, I woke up early and went outside to explore a little. There was a small path leading from the cabin deeper into the woods. It wasn't marked on the map, but it looked like it had been used before, just barely. A faint trail through the undergrowth. I followed it for a few minutes, not planning to go far, just curious. The trees were thick, tall, and close together. The sunlight filtered through in patches. The trail went on longer than I expected, maybe half a mile before it opened into a small clearing. There was something in the clearing. Another cabin. This one wasn't like mine. It looked older, smaller, and broken down. The roof sagged on one side, and the windows were either missing or boarded up. There was no trail leading to it except the one I had just followed. It didn't make sense. The listing had said there were no other structures within 5 miles. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I had a weird feeling in my chest, Not fear exactly, but something like unease. I didn't go inside. I just stood there for a while and then walked back. When I got back to my cabin, the door was open. At first, I thought maybe I hadn't latched it properly, but the door handle had a locking latch that clicked into place when shut. I was pretty sure I had locked it when I left. Inside, nothing looked disturbed. My backpack was where I left it. The fire was out, but that was expected. Still, something felt off. I checked all my stuff, nothing missing, nothing moved. Maybe I was just being paranoid. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that second cabin. The way it looked abandoned, but not completely rotten. Like someone might still use it now and then. The path wasn't overgrown enough to be completely forgotten. That's what stuck with me. I decided to go back the next day, but this time I brought a flashlight and a hunting knife I had packed, just in case. I reached the clearing again just before noon. The sun was high, but the trees made it feel like early morning. I stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at that cabin again. This time I approached it. Up close, the place looked worse than I thought. The wood was weathered, the door had a huge crack down the middle, and the hinges were rusted. I slowly pushed it open, half expecting the whole thing to fall off. Didn't. It creaked loudly, louder than my own cabin's door had. Inside, it was dark and cold. The air smelled like mildew and something else, something metallic. The floor was soft in places, rotting. There was a cot in the corner, an old wood stove, and a table with something on it. I stepped in slowly, the knife in my hand. On the table was a metal box like a tackle box. I opened it. Inside were several folded papers, a rusted key, a small pocket knife, and a Polaroid photo. The photo showed a man standing outside the same cabin, but the trees in the background looked different, shorter, less grown in. The picture looked old, maybe from the 80s or 90s. I unfolded one of the papers. It was a handwritten note. Most of it was faded, but I could make out a few words. "Don't stay too long, watches the trail." That was all I could read. The rest was smudged. I didn't know what to make of it. I put everything back in the box and left it where I found it. As I walked back, I had the strange feeling I was being watched. Not by something supernatural, just by someone. That evening, just before dark, I thought I saw someone standing in the woods across from my cabin. I was inside, looking out through the window. The figure didn't move. It was too far to see clearly, but it looked like a person, just standing still among the trees. I stared for maybe 10 minutes. Then I blinked, and they were gone. That night, I kept the fire going as long as I could. I didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise outside. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like footsteps on the deck. Slow, deliberate. I stayed still, breathing shallow. The footsteps stopped near the door. I waited, staring at the shadows on the floor from the moonlight through the window. Nothing happened. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep sitting up, because I woke up just after sunrise. I opened the door slowly, heart pounding. There were faint boot prints in the frost on the deck. I told myself someone might be squatting in the old cabin. Maybe I had spooked them by showing up. Maybe they were just trying to scare me away. I decided I would leave the next morning. I only had a couple days left on the rental anyway. I didn't want trouble. I just wanted to get out safely. But that last full day wasn't easy. I kept hearing things in the woods. Sticks snapping, faint movement just out of sight. I didn't go outside. I barely moved from the chair near the stove. I kept the knife in my hand all day. At one point, around mid-afternoon, I heard something under the cabin. The crawl space wasn't big. Maybe 2 feet of space between the ground and the floorboards. I could hear scraping sounds, like something or someone was crawling slowly underneath. I knelt down near the stove and pressed my ear to the floor. The sound stopped. I stayed up the whole night again. Every so often, I heard faint thuds from underneath. I didn't dare go outside. At first light, I packed up quickly and left. I didn't eat. I didn't drink coffee. I just got out. The dirt road was slick from frost, and I almost got stuck in one spot, but I managed to make it back to the highway. When I finally got cell reception again, I looked up the listing to message the host that I had left early. But the listing was gone. The entire profile was deleted. That night, Back home, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that photo, the man standing in front of the cabin. Something about his face had looked familiar, but I couldn't place it at the time. So I went back and looked through the photos I had taken during my trip. One of them was a selfie I had taken on the first day, standing outside the cabin. In the background, barely visible in the trees behind me, was the same figure I had seen 2 nights ago, just standing, watching. I never reported it to the police because I didn't know what to report. I hadn't been hurt. Nothing had been stolen. I couldn't even prove someone had been there. But I've never gone back into the woods alone again. I still don't know who that man was or why he was watching me, or if he still uses that second cabin. But the thought that someone might be living out there, far from any law or neighbor, watching people who think they're alone, that's more terrifying than any ghost story. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still wake up with the image of that photo burned into my head. Not because I saw him behind me, but because I realized why his face looked familiar. It looked just like mine, only older, and that, somehow, is the part one still can't explain. I needed a break from the city. The constant noise, the crowds, the feeling of being boxed in. It had gotten too much. I worked a desk job that kept me indoors 10 hours a day, staring at a screen, answering emails, attending meetings that went nowhere. My sleep was shallow, my appetite was off, and I felt like I was losing parts of myself. I wasn't sick, but I wasn't okay either. I started looking for somewhere I could be alone for a while, somewhere quiet, somewhere far. After a few days of scrolling through listings, I found a cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. The owner described it as off-grid but fully stocked, with a small generator for power, a working stove, and a clean well for water. No cell service, no internet, just a cabin, trees, and silence. Sounded perfect. The drive took nearly 2 days. I stopped overnight in a small town and bought enough supplies to last me 2 weeks. I had packed canned food, dried goods, bottled water just in case, a camping stove, a couple flashlights, extra batteries, and a solar charger for my phone, even though I knew I wouldn't be using it. I had a hunting knife too, not because I planned on hunting, but because it felt smart to bring one. The last hour of the drive was rough. The road narrowed into a single dirt path full of potholes and low branches that scraped the roof of my car. But when I finally reached the clearing and the cabin came into view, I felt something settle inside me. It was small and plain, with dark wood walls and a green metal roof. It looked worn but solid. I stepped out of the car and just stood there for a while, listening. There was nothing. No cars, no people, not even planes overhead. Just wind in the trees and the faint creak of wood as the cabin settled. I unpacked slowly, checking out the inside of the place. There was one room downstairs with a cot against the wall, a wood-burning stove, a tiny table with a chair, and shelves stocked with matches, candles, and some basic tools. A ladder led up to a small loft where there was another cot and a narrow window that looked out over the forest. The first few days were everything I hoped they'd be. I slept deeply for the first time in months. I cooked simple meals, went for long walks through the woods, read books I'd been putting off, and sat outside watching the sun move through the trees. I didn't see anyone, no signs of people. The nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, according to the cabin owner. I felt like I could finally breathe. On the 5th night, something woke me up. A thump, not loud, but sharp, like something had hit the side of the cabin. I sat up in the loft, heart beating a little faster. I listened for a while but heard nothing else. I figured it was an animal, a deer brushing against the wall, maybe a raccoon. I lay back down. But the next morning, I found something strange. Just beneath the small kitchen window, the dirt looked disturbed. Not like something had dug into it, but like someone had been standing there. The ground was soft from the rain a couple days earlier, and there were marks, not full footprints, but slight impressions. I crouched down and studied them. Too big to be from a raccoon, too narrow for a bear. Maybe a person, but why would someone be out here? I tried to brush it off, told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Maybe the prints were old, from the owner or someone else who had stayed before. I didn't want to ruin the peace I had found, so I let it go. That night, I locked the door and pulled the ladder up into the loft with me. I kept my knife beside the cot, just in case. I told myself it was overkill, but I still did it. The next night, I heard it again. Another thump, this time on the other side of the cabin. I didn't get up. I didn't look. I just lay there, heart pounding, staring into the dark until I fell asleep. The following morning, I found more disturbed dirt, this time near the front door. Same thing, slight impressions, not clear footprints, but definite signs that someone had been standing there. Watching, I checked the lock. It hadn't been tampered with. Everything inside was untouched, but something felt off. That peaceful feeling I had before was gone. I kept looking over my shoulder during walks. I stopped reading. I barely ate. The next few days were quiet.
No noises.
No marks. I started to think maybe I'd imagined it all. Maybe I was just stressed and my mind was playing tricks on me. I lowered the ladder again and tried to relax. That didn't last. One night, just as I was falling asleep, I heard something. Not a thump this time, a scrape, like metal against wood. Then another, came from the back wall just behind the stove. I sat up fast. I waited. It happened again. A slow, dragging scrape, then silence. I stayed awake the whole night, knife in hand, staring out the tiny window. I didn't see anything, but I felt it, that pressure, like something was out there, just beyond the trees. The first light, I went outside. I walked around the cabin. My heart sank. Near the back wall, the wood was scratched. Thin lines about waist high, like something had dragged a blade across it. I felt sick. This wasn't an animal. This was someone. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But I told myself I was being paranoid. That maybe the scratches had always been there and I just hadn't noticed. I hated the idea of running back to the city after just a week. I didn't want to admit that I was scared, that someone or something had gotten to me, so I stayed. I regret that now. That night was the worst. I locked the door, shut the windows, pulled the ladder up, and sat in the loft with the knife on my lap. I didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. A soft knock on the door. 3 taps. Slow, deliberate, then silence. I froze. Every part of my body went still. I didn't breathe. I just listened. Another knock. Then the sound of something moving around the cabin. Crunching leaves, snapping twigs, a faint grunt, heavy breathing. Then it stopped. Completely. I waited until the sun came up. Then I climbed down and opened the door. There was something hanging from the door handle, piece of twine, and tied to it a single rabbit's foot. Fresh, bloody, that was it. I packed my things in 10 minutes. I didn't clean up. I didn't eat. I threw everything into the car and started driving. I didn't care about the potholes or the branches. I just drove. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. When I got to a gas station, I used the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked pale. My hands were shaking. I felt like I'd been pulled out of a nightmare. I told the cabin owner I had to leave early. I didn't give a reason. I never heard back. That was 6 months ago. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't go hiking anymore. I don't go camping. Sometimes I hear small noises outside my apartment window and my heart starts racing. I check the locks every night. I keep the knife beside my bed. I still don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this, someone was watching me. Someone walked through those woods at night. Someone scratched the cabin walls. Someone left that rabbit's foot. And they knew I was alone. They wanted me to know. And that thought has stayed with me ever since. It was early November when I decided to take a break from everything and head to the mountains. I was living alone in a small apartment in the city, working a desk job that left me staring at a screen 10 hours a day. I hadn't taken time off in over a year. My back hurt all the time. I couldn't sleep well anymore, and I started to feel like I was just wasting away in front of that computer. I needed to breathe different air, feel something real. So I booked a remote cabin for a week, deep in the woods of northern Idaho. It was one of those off-grid places with no Wi-Fi, no phone signal, no neighbors. The listing said it was an old logger's cabin that had been restored, still had a wood stove, a hand pump for water, and solar panels that could barely power a couple of light bulbs. I drove for 9 hours to get there. The paved road turned to gravel, then narrowed to a dirt track that twisted through dense forest. There was a spot where I had to stop, get out, and move some fallen branches just to keep going. The trees grew thicker the farther I drove. I had downloaded offline maps, but even those stopped updating by the time I reached the last stretch. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked even older than the pictures. It was small, with weathered wood, a tin roof, and a porch with a rocking chair that looked like it hadn't rocked in years. There was a shed out back and a rusted axe stuck in a stump beside it. No sound except wind through the trees. I liked it immediately. The inside was simple. One room with a wood stove, a small bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a shelf with old books and canned food. The place smelled of pine and smoke. There was a lantern on the table and a couple flashlights. I set up my sleeping bag on the bed, stacked some firewood beside the stove, and filled a pot with water from the pump. That first night, I made a fire, heated a can of chili, and sat outside under the stars. The sky was clear and full of them. I hadn't seen a night that dark or a sky that bright in a long time. I slept better than I had in months. The next day, I hiked around the area. There was an old trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. I followed it for hours, climbing hills, crossing small creeks, and seeing no one. Just trees, birds, and the occasional deer. I marked my trail with small sticks and rocks so I wouldn't get lost. It felt good to sweat, to breathe, to feel the weight of my own legs again. When I got back, it was already late afternoon. I was tired, but in a good way. I made another fire, cooked some rice and beans, and sat on the porch again. The silence out there was thick. No cars, no people, not even a distant plane. Just wind and my own thoughts. By the third day, I started to feel something was off. It wasn't anything clear, just a kind of pressure, like something was watching me from the trees. I kept telling myself it was just being alone for the first time in a while. I wasn't used to the quiet, that was all. But still, I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, checking the windows, locking the door at night even though I hadn't seen another soul. I started sleeping with the flashlight beside me. On the 4th morning, I noticed something strange. I had left my boots outside the door to dry. They were moved, not far, maybe a couple of feet, but not where I left them. At first, I thought maybe an animal had nudged them, but there were no bite marks or scratches, just moved. I brushed it off, probably rolled from the wind or something. I told myself that even though the wind hadn't been strong. Later that day, I went back on the trail. I was trying to make it to a ridge I'd seen on the map that supposedly had a great view. About 2 hours in, I saw footprints. Not mine, not animal. Boot prints, old but clear. They crossed the trail and disappeared into the trees. I followed them for a while but lost them in the underbrush. I stood there for a long time trying to think. Who would be out here? The cabin was 10 miles from the nearest ranger station. Maybe a hunter? But I hadn't heard a single gunshot the whole time I'd been there. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept listening. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the leaves outside, made me sit up. At one point, I was sure I heard something walk past the cabin. Heavy steps. Not fast, not loud, just one step. Then another. Then nothing. I didn't move. I stayed under the covers, flashlight clutched in my hand, barely breathing. I didn't sleep until the sun came up. On the 5th day, I found something that chilled me more than anything else. I was chopping some firewood behind the shed when I saw marks on the bark of a tree near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought they were just animal scratches, but when I looked closer, they were symbols, carved deep, not letters but shapes, sharp lines, strange curves, and below them another set of boot prints. Fresh. I checked around but saw no one. My chest tightened. I didn't know what the symbols meant, but they didn't feel random. That night, I didn't light a fire. I stayed inside, flashlight off, sitting in the dark with my ears open. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow. This time they stopped right outside the cabin. Then I heard a soft knock. Not loud, just 3 taps. Then silence. I didn't move. I sat there, heart pounding, for what felt like hours. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I opened the door slowly. There was nothing, no one. But on the porch, near the boots I now kept inside, was a small stone, perfectly round, clean, sitting right in the middle. I didn't touch it. I packed my things. I was done. I knew I couldn't stay another night. The drive out was longer. The road felt even narrower. At one point, I thought I saw someone standing in the trees, just beyond the bend. I didn't stop to check. I kept driving until I hit the gravel road, then the paved highway. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not for a long time. I didn't have proof, just my memory. I checked the map again and saw that the trail I followed wasn't listed anymore. Maybe it had been closed. Maybe not. I tried to forget about it. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I think about that knock, about those symbols, about the round stone left just so. And I wonder how far from the cabin they followed me, how close they got, or if they ever left at all. I never went back. I canceled my account on the rental site. I still hike sometimes, still camp, but never alone, never off-grid, and never in Idaho. What happened out there was real. Not ghosts, not fairy tales. Just something or someone who didn't want me there. I still don't know what they wanted. Maybe I was just a trespasser in the wrong place. Maybe they were just watching. Or maybe they were waiting for one more night. Either way, I was lucky to leave when I did. And I won't be going back to find out what would have happened if I stayed. It was early October when I drove out to a remote cabin in the northern part of Michigan. I had taken 2 weeks off work, not because I wanted a vacation, but because I just needed to get away. Everything in my life had been piling up. My job, my apartment, the traffic, my neighbors, the constant buzz of city life. I couldn't think straight anymore. My doctor said I needed rest. I didn't want to rest at home. I wanted silence, real silence. Somewhere where I couldn't hear car horns or people yelling outside my window. I found the cabin on a local rental site. It wasn't listed on the big ones like Airbnb or Booking. It was simple, just one picture, a short description, and a phone number. I called. An older man answered, and he gave me directions after I told him my dates. He told me there was no cell service out there and no Wi-Fi, and I told him that was perfect. I packed everything I thought I might need for 2 weeks. Canned food, bottled water, matches, a flashlight, extra batteries, a couple of books, my old hatchet, a knife, some blankets, and a few changes of clothes. I also brought my camera. I used to take a lot of pictures, and I figured I might try to get back into that while I was out there. The drive up took nearly 8 hours. The roads got narrower the farther north I went. Eventually, I was driving on a single-lane dirt road through thick woods. There were no signs, no mile markers, nothing but trees. The directions the man gave me were written on a notepad in my passenger seat. He'd said, "Go past the third left after the bridge, then take the next right up the hill. If you pass the big rock with the spray paint on it, you went too far." I found it. The cabin was small and worn down. It looked like no one had stayed there in years. The porch creaked when I stepped on it. There were pine needles all over the steps and cobwebs in the corners of the windows. But it was what I needed. Quiet, isolated, and simple. Inside, the cabin had one main room with a bed in the corner, a wood stove, a small table with 2 chairs, and some old cabinets. There was no fridge, no sink, just a hand pump for water and a cooler. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 yards behind the cabin, up a small hill. There was no electricity. At night, I used my flashlight and some candles I found in a drawer. The first few days were peaceful. I spent time walking around the woods, reading, chopping a little firewood, and taking pictures of birds, trees, and animal tracks. I didn't see any people or hear anything but wind and birds. At night, I kept a fire going in the wood stove and stayed wrapped in blankets, writing in a small notebook. I started sleeping better. My head felt clearer. I began to think maybe this trip was exactly what I needed. But things started to feel different after a few nights. It began small. I woke up once and thought I heard footsteps outside. It was probably just an animal, I told myself, a raccoon or a deer, but I still got up and checked. I shined my flashlight out the windows. I didn't see anything. I went back to bed. The next night, I heard what sounded like a thump against the back wall of the cabin. Not loud, but enough to make me sit up in bed. Again, I told myself it could be a branch falling, or maybe a squirrel. Still, I didn't sleep much that night. By the end of the first week, I was feeling uneasy. I wasn't sure why. The woods felt different. Still quiet, but not peaceful. More like the quiet was hiding something. I stopped exploring as far from the cabin. I kept my knife in my pocket. At night, I started locking the cabin door with a small metal latch. There was no real lock, so I stacked a chair under the handle just in case. I knew it wouldn't stop someone if they wanted in, but it made me feel better. On the 8th day, I woke up to find something strange. A small pile of rocks was stacked right in front of the cabin door. 6 or 7 stones balanced carefully. They hadn't been there the day before. I hadn't done it. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone or anything. The woods looked normal. Still, it felt off. I kicked the rocks aside and tried to shake it off, but my stomach felt tight. That night, I kept the fire going until nearly 2 a.m. I sat near the window with my flashlight on my lap and the knife beside me. I didn't hear anything that night, but I barely slept. I started counting down the days until I could leave. The next morning, I found something else. This time, it was a stick figure hanging from the tree near the outhouse. It was made of small twigs tied with string, like the kind of thing a kid might make in arts and crafts. But there was no reason for it to be there. No one knew I was out here. I hadn't seen a single car or person since I arrived. I cut it down and threw it into the fire. My hands were shaking. I wanted to leave then, but I told myself maybe someone else had rented the cabin before and left it behind. Maybe I just didn't notice it before. Still, I packed my bag and kept everything close to the door, just in case I needed to go fast. I filled the car with the gear I didn't need anymore. That night, I heard footsteps again, but this time it was different. They weren't fast. They were slow, deliberate, crunching on the dried leaves outside. I didn't move. I turned off the flashlight and sat in the dark, listening. The steps circled the cabin. I could hear them behind me, then to the side, then near the front. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. Then they stopped. I waited another hour before moving. When I finally turned the flashlight back on, I saw something on the window, a handprint, smudged, greasy, too big for a child. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At sunrise, I went outside and looked around. There were footprints in the soft dirt, but they were hard to follow. No clear pattern, just scattered. I decided to leave. I didn't care that I had 6 days left. I wasn't going to stay another night. I loaded everything into the car, locked the cabin as best I could, and took the dirt road back toward the highway. But when I got to where the dirt road met the main road, I found a tree had fallen across it. It was big, too big to move on my own. It looked fresh. The leaves were still green. I got out, walked around it, and looked for a way to drive around, but the forest was too thick. No room. I thought about using my hatchet, but it would take me hours, maybe all day. I had no chainsaw. I backed the car up and drove back toward the cabin, hoping I might find another way out. There wasn't one. There was only the road I came in on. I stayed in the car until nightfall, afraid to go back inside the cabin. But when it started to get cold, I had no choice. I lit a fire in the stove, pulled the chair back under the door handle, and sat on the bed with my flashlight and knife. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. This time, they didn't stop outside. I heard the porch creak. Then something brushed against the wall. Then silence. I waited. I held the knife so tight my hand started to cramp. But nothing else happened. At dawn, I looked outside. Nothing. No sign of anyone. But the stick figure was back, hanging from the same branch I'd burned it from. I stayed one more night because I didn't have a choice. But I didn't sleep. I didn't light a fire. I stayed in the corner with my back against the wall, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I thought about running, but I had no idea how far I was from help. 10 miles? More? In the woods, with no cell service, no GPS. I was stuck. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of an engine. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but I looked out and saw a truck coming up the road. A large pickup with an older man behind the wheel. It was the owner. He stepped out and asked if everything was okay. I didn't say much. I just asked if he could help me move the tree. He nodded. Together, we used a chain and his truck to drag the tree out of the way. I didn't ask him about the stick figure or the rocks or the handprint. I didn't want to hear what he might say. I just thanked him and drove off. I didn't stop until I hit the nearest gas station, nearly an hour away. I didn't report anything. I didn't tell anyone. I wasn't sure what to say. There wasn't really a crime. Nothing stolen. No one hurt. Just a creeping feeling that someone had been watching me the entire time. It's been a year. I still think about that place. I still wake up some nights thinking I hear someone outside my window. I keep the curtains shut now. I moved to a different apartment, somewhere with people, neighbors, traffic. I used to hate the noise. Now I sleep better with it. Silence scares me more than anything else ever has. I needed a break from the city. Everything was getting too loud, traffic, people, work. I'd been working long hours at a tech company, staring at screens, dealing with constant messages and phone calls. My head hurt all the time, so I took a week off, packed up my things, and rented a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. It was far away from everything. No cell service, no internet, just a small wooden structure tucked into a pine forest near a shallow lake. The photos online made it look peaceful. It had a wood stove, a small kitchen, a basic bathroom, and a porch that overlooked the trees. I drove up early on a Monday morning, taking back roads after the main highway ended. The further I went, the more the scenery changed. Tall trees rose on both sides, and the air got colder even though it was still mid-September. I kept driving until I reached a narrow dirt road that led into the woods. It was bumpy and narrow, and I had to drive slowly so I didn't damage my car. Eventually, I saw the cabin through the trees. It was exactly like the pictures. Small, dark-stained wood, a metal chimney, and a porch with 2 old rocking chairs. I unlocked the place using a key the owner had left under a rock. Inside, it smelled like old wood and pine needles. There was a faint smell of smoke from the stove, but it wasn't unpleasant. I dropped my bags and walked around. The place had one main room with a bed on one side and a small kitchen on the other. The bathroom was attached with just a shower, toilet, and sink. I was happy. It was quiet. No traffic.
No emails.
Just wind and trees. That first night was peaceful. I lit a fire in the stove, cooked some canned soup, and sat on the porch watching the sunset. The wind moved through the trees in a way that made everything feel alive. The temperature dropped quickly after dark, and I went to bed under 2 thick blankets. I fell asleep listening to the creaks of the cabin and the occasional call of an owl. The next morning, I went for a walk down a small trail behind the cabin. It wound through the trees and led to the lake. The water was still and clear, with fog hanging over it like a thin blanket. I stayed there for a while, skipping rocks and listening to the birds. Felt good. I was finally starting to relax. I spent the rest of the day reading, chopping some wood, and sitting on the porch. I didn't do anything important, and that was the point. On the 3rd day, something felt off. Started small. I noticed a footprint in the dirt near the trail. At first, I thought it was mine, but it was larger and deeper. I looked at my own boots and saw the patterns didn't match. I figured maybe a hunter had passed through or someone else staying nearby. Still, it made me a little uneasy. I hadn't seen a single person since I got there. No cars.
No distant sounds.
Just trees and animals. That night, I locked the door and windows before bed. I usually left a small window open to let in the cool air, but not this time. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been close. I told myself it was nothing, just paranoia. Being alone in the woods can do that to you. Around midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. It was still dark. The fire had died down, and the cabin was cold. I pulled the blanket tighter and listened. For a while, I didn't hear anything. Then I heard a crack outside, like a branch snapping. It wasn't close, but it was loud enough to make me sit up. I stayed still, listening. Another sound, softer this time, like footsteps in dry leaves. I didn't move. I waited, stopped after a while. I didn't hear anything else. I laid back down, but I didn't fall asleep right away. I kept listening, eyes open, waiting for another sound. Nothing came. Eventually, I dozed off. The next morning, I went outside and checked around the cabin. I found another footprint, this one closer to the porch. Still not mine. It looked like a boot, but older. The edges of the print were crumbling, like the sole was worn. I looked around the trees, but didn't see anything else. I went back inside and made coffee, trying to tell myself it was still nothing. Just someone hiking. Maybe a local. Maybe a hunter. Later that day, I found something else. Behind the cabin, about 20 feet into the trees, I saw a piece of cloth hanging from a branch. It was dark, torn, and looked like it had been there a while. I pulled it down. It looked like part of a shirt. I didn't recognize it. I walked a little further and saw what looked like an old fire pit. Stones arranged in a circle with black ash in the middle. But no one had used it recently. The ash was old, broken down, almost like dust. I went back to the cabin and sat on the porch for a long time. Something didn't feel right. I thought about leaving, but I had paid for the full week and didn't want to feel like I was running from nothing. I stayed one more night. That night was the worst. I went to bed early, just after sunset. I didn't feel like eating. I kept thinking about the footprints and the cloth. I locked the door again and kept the hatchet I had used for chopping wood next to the bed. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but I couldn't explain it. It wasn't just the signs of someone else being out there. It was the silence, the feeling that I was being watched. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a thud. Not outside, inside. I sat up fast. I listened. Another thud. I reached for the hatchet and stood up, heart pounding. The room was dark, except for the small red glow from the stove. I moved slowly, trying not to make noise. I checked the front door. Still locked. I checked the bathroom. Nothing. Then I heard a sound above me. The attic. I hadn't even thought about it before. There was a small hatch in the ceiling above the bed. I had assumed it was just for storage, and I hadn't opened it. But now something had moved up there. I stood under the hatch, listening. Nothing. I waited. Then soft scraping, like fingernails or maybe something being dragged. I backed away slowly and grabbed a flashlight from the drawer. I aimed it at the hatch. Dust floated in the beam. I waited another 10 minutes. The sound stopped. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the chair by the door, holding the hatchet, watching the hatch. When the sun finally came up, I grabbed my stuff and packed it into the car. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to leave. Before I drove away, I looked back at the cabin. The woods were still, quiet, but that silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like something was pressing down on everything. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything, but I knew I wasn't alone out there. I drove straight home, barely stopping. When I got back to the city, I sent a message to the cabin owner. I didn't tell them everything. Just said something felt off and I had left early. They didn't reply. A few days later, I saw a news article online. A hiker had gone missing near the same area. A man in his 40s. His car was found near one of the trails not far from where I had stayed. They found his backpack deep in the woods, but no trace of him. The article said it wasn't the first time someone had gone missing in that part of the forest. I haven't gone camping since. I still think about that night sometimes, sitting in the dark with the sound above my head. I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the hatch. I wonder how long that person or thing had been up there. But I'm done wondering. I got lucky. I left. That's all that matters now. I still have the torn piece of cloth. I keep it in a drawer, hidden away. I don't know why I didn't throw it out. Maybe I keep it to remind myself that the world isn't always peaceful, even in the quietest places. It was early September when I decided to take a break from everything. Life had been a mess. Work had been eating away at me. I barely slept. And when I did, it wasn't restful. I felt tired all the time, mentally and physically. I figured some time away from the city would help clear my head. So I booked a week-long stay at a small cabin up in northern Idaho, deep in the woods. It wasn't the kind of place people knew much about. I found it on a forum where folks shared quiet places to disconnect. The cabin was simple. No Wi-Fi, no TV, no cell service. Just a small wood cabin near a lake, with trees crowding every inch of land around it. The road that led there turned into dirt about 10 miles before the cabin. From the point where I parked my truck, I had to hike nearly half a mile through uneven, narrow trails to reach the place. The air felt clean. The silence was thick. That first evening, I sat on the front steps and just listened. No traffic, no people, no machines. Just wind in the trees and water brushing against the rocks at the edge of the lake. Inside, the cabin had the basics. A twin bed with a thick blanket, a wood stove, a small table, 2 chairs, a shelf with some old books, a gas lantern, a propane cooking stove, and a hand pump at the sink that connected to a rainwater tank outside. There was a small outhouse out back. It all felt perfect, like a little world where I could disappear and think. I spent the first couple of days walking around the woods nearby. There were no marked trails, but I stayed close to the lake and followed animal paths. I read a few chapters from a book I found about local trees and birds. I ate simple food I brought with me: canned soup, dried fruit, beef jerky, granola bars. The silence grew more comfortable with each day. On the third night, something changed. It had been warm during the day, but as the sun dropped behind the hills, the temperature took a sharp dive. I built a fire in the stove and stayed inside. Around 9 p.m., I stepped out to use the outhouse. It was pitch black, but I had my flashlight. The beam caught the fog beginning to rise from the lake. A chill ran through me. I told myself it was just the cold and went back in. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The cabin creaked. The trees groaned. Every sound felt sharper, closer. I kept telling myself it was all normal. Old wood makes noise. The wind pushes on the trees. I finally dozed off sometime after midnight. I woke up with a start. It was still dark. I didn't know what had pulled me out of sleep. I didn't hear anything now, but something felt off. I stayed still for a while, listening. Then I heard it. A soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves, came from outside, maybe near the side window. I held my breath. Then another step, slower this time. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the sound was heavy, deliberate. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling in the dark. I didn't have a weapon, only a camping knife in my backpack. The sound came again, closer this time, just outside the cabin wall. Then it stopped. I stayed like that for hours, I think. The rest of the night passed slowly. The first light, I finally got up. I checked outside. There were no prints I could see, but the ground was mostly dry leaves and pine needles. I walked around the cabin slowly. Nothing seemed disturbed. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a bear. But the next night, the same thing happened. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to that same crunching noise. This time, it circled the cabin. I heard it go from one side to the other. It wasn't fast. It sounded like someone pacing, just outside, making sure I knew they were there. Then it stopped again. That morning, I felt exhausted. I considered leaving, but I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting. It was probably just nerves. I took a longer walk that day, tried to shake the feeling off. When I came back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. A stick had been propped up against the door. I hadn't left it there. It wasn't a big stick, maybe 2 feet long, leaned carefully against the center of the door frame. I picked it up and tossed it aside. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up with the lantern on low, watching the door. Hours passed. Around 3 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time, I stood up and held the knife. The steps stopped right by the front door. Then I heard a soft tap. Once, then again, like someone lightly knocking. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My breathing felt loud. I stared at the door for what felt like forever. Then the steps started again, slow and steady, moving around to the side of the cabin. I heard a soft scraping sound, like something dragging against the wood. It went all around the cabin, then faded into the distance. When the sun came up, I packed my things. I stuffed everything into my backpack, took only what I could carry, and left the rest. I didn't clean up. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to my truck felt longer than I remembered. Every sound in the woods made me jump. I didn't stop once. When I reached my truck, I felt a rush of relief. I opened the door and threw my bag in the back. Just before I started the engine, I looked at the ground nearby. There, in the dirt beside the truck, was another stick, just like the one by the cabin door, leaned carefully against the front tire. I drove straight home, didn't stop for food, didn't look back. When I got home, I closed all the blinds, locked the doors, and didn't leave the house for 2 days. It's been almost a year since then. I don't go into the woods anymore. I can't. Even going to the park in my neighborhood makes my skin crawl. I told a few friends about what happened, but they just said I imagined it, that it was stress, isolation. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. I still don't know who or what was out there. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't some random person lost in the woods. They knew I was there. They watched me. They left signs. They wanted me to know they were close. The only thing that keeps me from going crazy is that I left when I did. I think if I had stayed one more night, I wouldn't have made it back. Whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. It was waiting for something. Maybe for me to come outside. Maybe for me to fall asleep. I don't know, but I'm glad I didn't find out. I deleted the post where I found that cabin. I can't remember the username of the person who shared it. There were no reviews, no comments, just coordinates and a few pictures. I think about going back sometimes, just to see if the cabin is still there. But every time I think about the walk through those trees, about the sound of those footsteps, I change my mind. Some places aren't meant to be found, and some cabins should be left empty forever. It was early October when I decided to take some time off work and get away from everything. Things had been stressful lately. Between the constant pressure at the office, a recent breakup, and my growing frustration with city life, I felt like I was on the edge of a breakdown. So I rented a remote cabin up in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. I found it on a listing site. The pictures showed a small wooden structure surrounded by dense pine forest, with no neighbors for miles. It was exactly what I needed. Complete isolation. No cell service. Just quiet. The drive took almost 11 hours. The last 2 were on dirt roads, winding deeper and deeper into the forest. I passed only a couple of hunters in dusty pickups. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the mountains. The place looked just like the pictures. It was small but solid. Dark brown wood, a tin roof, a little porch out front, and a single chimney. There was a generator in a small shed out back, a propane tank, and a firewood pile stacked against the wall. Inside, the cabin was clean and basic. One main room with a couch, a wood-burning stove, a small table with 2 chairs, and a kitchenette. There was a narrow hallway leading to a tiny bathroom and a bedroom with a twin bed. It smelled faintly of pine and old wood. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, not even a radio. Just the wind outside and the ticking of an old clock on the wall. I unpacked quickly, made myself a simple dinner, and lit a fire in the stove. That night, I sat on the porch with a heavy blanket over my shoulders, sipping hot tea and listening to the forest. The silence was different here. In the city, silence meant background hums and distant sirens. Here it was deeper, thicker, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I went to bed early that first night, worn out from the long drive. It took a while to fall asleep, but when I did, it was deep. The kind of sleep you only get after months of being too tense to relax. I woke up around 7 a.m. to the soft orange light of sunrise pouring through the curtains. Felt good. I made coffee, cooked some eggs on the propane stove, and sat outside to eat. I had no set plans for the trip. My only goal was to disconnect. So I spent that first day walking a few miles around the area. The trees were thick and tall. The paths were faint, just trails worn down by deer or past hikers. I kept track of my steps carefully, marking spots with bright tape I'd brought so I wouldn't get lost. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already getting low. I felt sore and satisfied. That evening, I lit a fire again, made a sandwich, and read a paperback I had brought. As it got dark, the forest around me came alive with night sounds. Owls, crickets, and something larger rustling through the underbrush in the distance. It made me pause a few times, listening. But each time, it passed quickly, and I told myself it was probably just deer. By the third day, I had settled into a routine. Wake up, eat, hike, read, sleep. My phone had no signal at all, which was fine. I had brought a satellite emergency beacon in case anything went wrong, but I didn't expect to need it. That afternoon, I went a little farther than I had before. I followed a game trail downhill toward a dry creek bed. There was an old hunting blind nearby, half collapsed, and I stopped there to rest. As I sat on a rock and ate a granola bar, I noticed something odd in the dirt. It looked like a large footprint, not a boot.
Bore.
Human. It was wide, with visible toes and a long arch. It looked fresh, maybe a day old. But what really made me pause was that it wasn't alone. There were several of them, all leading in the same direction, deeper into the woods. At first, I thought maybe someone else was camping nearby. But then I realized the prints weren't heading from or to any road or trail. They cut straight through the densest part of the forest. No clear path, no signs of gear, just footprints, bare ones. Something about that unsettled me. I stood there for a while, staring into the trees, then decided to head back. I made sure to take a different route, one I had marked previously, and kept checking over my shoulder. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every sound outside the cabin felt louder. I kept hearing what sounded like footsteps on the pine needles. Not close, not definite, just faint crunches here and there. I told myself it was my imagination, that I'd spooked myself with the footprints, but the feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. The next morning, I found something strange. On the porch railing was a dead rabbit. Its neck was broken, and its fur was matted with dried blood. It had been placed there, neatly right in the middle, not chewed on, not scattered, just set down. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't there when I went to bed. Something or someone had put it there during the night. I looked around the area, but there were no fresh prints, nothing disturbed. I used a stick to move the rabbit off the porch, then threw it deep into the woods. After that, I stayed inside most of the day. The wind had picked up, and the clouds hung low. A storm was coming. By nightfall, rain was falling in sheets. The wind howled against the trees, and I could hear branches creaking outside. I made the fire strong and closed all the curtains, but I still felt like something was off. I kept the axe from the woodpile next to the bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a loud thump against the side of the cabin. Then another, slow, deliberate thumps, not random branches. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. Then came a dragging sound, something scraping along the wall outside. It moved around the cabin slowly, then stopped. The wind made it hard to hear clearly, but I was sure I heard breathing. Deep, labored, right outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Just waited. Minutes passed. Then footsteps, heavy ones, crunching through wet leaves, moving away. I lay there until sunrise, gripping the axe so hard my knuckles hurt. When it was fully light, I got up and checked outside. There were marks on the wall, long scratches in the wood, about waist-high, like someone had dragged metal or bone across it. There were no clear footprints, just disturbed pine needles and mud. I knew then that this wasn't a bear, or any animal. Something or someone was out there. I spent the rest of the day on edge. I packed my bag, loaded up the emergency beacon, and considered leaving. But the road out was soaked and muddy. I didn't want to risk getting stuck halfway. I told myself if anything else happened, I'd leave at first light. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't turn on any lights. I I sat in the dark, listening. The rain had stopped, but fog had settled in. Thick fog that hugged the ground and muffled sound. Around midnight, I heard something on the porch. The boards creaked under weight. Then a soft tapping. Not knocking, tapping, like fingers. I held my breath. My chest felt tight. The tapping moved along the wall to the window, then stopped. Then came a low, slow dragging sound again. After that, nothing. At dawn, I opened the door. There was another rabbit on the porch. This one was skinned, just muscle and bone, set in the exact same spot as the first. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my gear, locked the cabin, and left. The road was slick, but my 4x4 handled it. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Once I got signal, I called the listing owner and told them what happened. They sounded surprised, but said sometimes hikers pass through. I didn't argue. I just kept driving. I didn't report it to the police. What could I say? That someone left rabbits and scratched my wall? I knew how that would sound, but I haven't gone back. I never will. Something was out there, and it wasn't an animal. It watched me, left things for me, got closer every night. And I think if I had stayed just one more night, I wouldn't be here writing this. The cabin is still listed. Same pictures, same description, but whoever rents it next won't know what I know. And that thought keeps me awake some nights, because I was lucky. I left, but someone else might not. It was late October when I decided to spend a few days alone in a cabin I had rented in northern Michigan. I found it through an old local website that advertised off-grid properties for people looking to disconnect. I had been feeling burned out after months of stressful work, and this cabin seemed like the perfect place to clear my head. It sat deep in the woods, a few miles off a gravel road that itself branched from a quiet 2-lane highway. According to the listing, there was no Wi-Fi, no electricity, and no running water, just a wood stove, a hand pump for water, and an outhouse. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive up was long. I left before sunrise and didn't reach the cabin until nearly 5 in the evening. The final stretch was the hardest. After I turned off the paved road, my tires crunched over gravel and then turned to soft dirt. Trees closed in on both sides until the road looked more like a trail. I drove slowly, trying to avoid potholes, and finally saw the clearing up ahead. The cabin looked just like the photos. Small, made of old timber, and slightly leaning to one side. The roof was tin, and the only window I could see was covered with a wooden shutter. It looked like something built decades ago, and from the outside, it felt like I had stepped back in time. There were no other houses, no power lines, no cell service. Just the sound of wind pushing through trees and the fading light of the evening. I parked near the tree line and walked up with my gear. I had brought everything I thought I might need. A sleeping bag, a flashlight with spare batteries, a couple of lanterns, a camp stove with fuel, a cooler packed with food and ice, a basic first aid kit, some clothes, and a knife I always carried when hiking. The key was in the lockbox just as promised, and I stepped inside. It smelled old and dry inside, like wood that had been baked by the sun for years. There was one small room. A twin-sized cot with a thin mattress sat against the wall. A small table and chair sat near the window, and the cast iron stove sat in the corner with a pile of split wood stacked beside it. There were a few shelves nailed into the walls with some old utensils, a few dusty pots, and a small oil lamp. The hand pump was outside about 20 feet from the door. I checked it, and it worked, though the water was cold and had a bit of an iron smell to it. Still, it was better than nothing. That first night was quiet. I cooked some soup on the stove, lit one of the lanterns, and read a paperback until the light made my eyes heavy. The darkness was thick out there. No stars, no moon, just blackness and silence. The woods felt different than usual. Not threatening exactly, just more silent than I was used to. I fell asleep easily enough, though I woke up twice, unsure what had stirred me. Maybe a raccoon near the walls. Maybe nothing at all. The second day, I walked a bit around the woods near the cabin. The trees were tall, mostly pines with some maple and oak mixed in. Most of the leaves had already dropped. The ground was soft with layers of old needles and leaves, and everything smelled earthy. I didn't see any other people. I didn't see any footprints or signs of hunters. It was just quiet. That afternoon, I noticed something strange near the base of a tree, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. There were scratches in the bark. Long, thin ones, like someone had dragged a knife or some kind of sharp metal across it in a lazy, downward motion. I looked around to see if there were more. I found 3 other trees with the same marks. All of them were around the same height, about chest level. They didn't look like animal claw marks. They were too even, too clean. It made me a little uneasy. I went back to the cabin and spent the rest of the day chopping more firewood. I kept looking into the woods, half expecting to see someone standing out there watching me. But I never did. Still, I kept my knife closer than before. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about those marks kept bothering me. I'd seen bear scratches on trees before. These weren't those, and they were fresh. I could still smell the scent of broken wood fibers. I kept thinking about the remoteness of the place. No one knew exactly where I was. The cell signal had dropped an hour before I even reached the gravel road. I had told a coworker I was going north for a cabin trip, but I hadn't given an address. I realized that if something happened out here, I could be gone for days before anyone noticed. I got up and lit the oil lamp. The flame flickered gently, giving the room a warm orange glow. I sat there for maybe an hour just listening. I thought I heard something outside once. A branch breaking. Maybe it was the wind. But there was no wind that night. The third day, I decided to walk farther out. I wanted to see if there was a trail or old hunting shack or anything else that might explain those marks. I brought my knife and flashlight even though it was still morning. I also packed a sandwich and some water. I walked east, away from the trees with the scratches, for about a mile. The woods stayed thick, but eventually I found a spot where the trees opened up a bit, and there was an old stone foundation half buried in leaves and moss. It looked like it had once been a cabin, long gone now. There were rusty nails sticking out of rotting beams, and the stones were blackened in places like they'd been burned. I looked around carefully, but didn't find anything recent. No cans, no trash, nothing to suggest anyone had been there in years. But as I was leaving, I saw something else. On a tree just beyond the old foundation was another set of those same scratch marks. Same angle, same height. These ones looked older, though maybe made months ago. I noticed the bark had started to grow back slightly over them. That made me wonder if this wasn't just a one-off thing. Maybe someone had been doing this for a while. I didn't want to stay out too long, so I headed back. On the way, I kept stopping to listen. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me. I turned quickly more than once, but there was nothing. I picked up my pace and got back to the cabin just as the sun was starting to dip. That night was when things really turned. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound outside. It was soft at first, like footsteps in dry leaves. I sat up in bed and listened. Then it stopped. Then I heard the crunch again. It was slow. One step, then another, then nothing, then one more. It was someone trying to move quietly. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it at the window. The shutter was still closed. I stayed quiet, not even breathing, waiting to hear it again. Minutes passed. Then there was a soft knock against the wall. Just once. Not like someone knocking at a door, more like a tap. I stood up and walked to the stove where I kept the knife. My hands were shaking. The knock didn't come again. I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair with the knife in my lap until the sun came up. When it did, I opened the door and walked around the cabin. I found footprints. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet, human ones. They came from the tree line, circled the cabin once, and then went back. The dirt was soft from rain a few days before, so the prints were clear.
No shoes.
Who the hell walks barefoot out here? I packed everything that morning. I shoved my clothes into my bag, dumped what food I had left into a cooler, and grabbed everything I could carry. I planned to leave right away, but my car wouldn't start. Nothing, not even a click. I checked under the hood, but I'm no mechanic. It all looked fine to me. I tried the ignition again. Dead. I felt cold all over. I thought about walking. I estimated the highway was about 5 miles. I could do that in a couple of hours. But something made me stop. Something told me not to leave the cabin unattended. I don't know why. Maybe I thought whoever was out there might come inside if I wasn't around. So I waited. I kept the lantern burning. I stayed inside all day, barely eating. The sun moved slow. The woods were too quiet. Around 3 p.m., I heard the pump handle squeak. Just once. I froze. Then nothing. I waited a few minutes, then looked through a crack in the shutter. No one was there. The pump stood still. That night, I barricaded the door with the table and cot. I kept the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. I sat in the corner and waited. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something move outside. This time, it came to the door. The footsteps were slow, steady. Then they stopped. I could hear breathing, just the faintest sound of someone exhaling. Then came the scratch. Started low on the door and moved upward. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath. My heart felt like it was beating in my throat. Then the sound stopped. Silence again. I didn't move, not until the sun rose. When I went outside, the scratch was there. A single long line carved into the wood of the door. It hadn't broken through, but it was deep. Deep enough to catch your finger in it. There were more barefoot prints. This time, they led all the way to the pump and then disappeared back into the woods. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I didn't care about the car. I packed the essentials into my backpack, grabbed my knife and flashlight, and started walking. The woods felt tighter than before. The light didn't feel right. I walked fast but tried to stay quiet. Every time I stepped on a stick, I froze. It was early October when I decided to spend a week alone at my uncle's old cabin deep in the Montana woods. I had just quit a job that had been draining the life out of me for 3 years straight. No notice, no backup plan, just walked out one morning and didn't look back. I needed time alone to think and figure out what I really wanted to do with my life. My uncle had passed away 5 years earlier and left the cabin to my dad, but none of us had gone up there since. My dad always said it was too far, too remote, and honestly, I think he just didn't want to deal with the upkeep. So when I asked if I could go stay there for a while, he didn't even hesitate to hand me the keys and directions. I arrived on a cloudy Tuesday afternoon. The drive up had been long and winding, with the last 2 hours spent navigating a narrow dirt road lined with pine trees so thick they blocked out most of the light. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by dense forest. It was old but sturdy, built from thick logs with a green metal roof that was spotted with rust. A short wooden porch wrapped around the front and one side, and a single trail led from the back door into the woods. Inside, the cabin smelled like aged wood and dust. The furniture was simple: a small couch, a rocking chair, a table with 2 chairs, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. The kitchen had an old propane-powered fridge and stove, and the pantry was still stocked with some canned goods that had probably expired years ago. The bedroom had a double bed with a wool blanket and a small window looking out into the trees. There was no electricity, no cell service, and no running water. Just an outhouse out back and a pump well near the porch. The first couple days were peaceful. I spent most of my time chopping firewood, walking through the woods, and writing in a notebook I brought with me. I cooked simple meals over the stove, boiled water for drinking and washing, and read some of the old books left behind by my uncle. It was quiet out there, eerily quiet. No cars, no voices, no background noise. Just wind in the trees, birds, and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. By the 3rd night, I started noticing little things that felt off. That evening, I was out near the pump well, just before dark, when I thought I heard someone walking through the trees. The sound was faint, like twigs snapping underfoot, but it stopped as soon as I turned to listen. I stood still for a while, staring into the woods, but saw nothing. I chalked it up to wildlife, probably a deer or something. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up every hour or so, sure I had heard something outside. Around 2 a.m., I finally got up and looked out the bedroom window. The moon was bright enough that I could see the clearing pretty well. Everything looked still. I stood there for a few minutes and then noticed something strange. The pump handle was tilted to one side. I was certain I had left it straight up after using it earlier. Again, I told myself it could have been wind or maybe it just settled on its own. But it stuck with me. The next day, I went for a long hike, hoping to shake off the uneasiness. I followed the trail behind the cabin for a few miles before it thinned out and eventually disappeared. I wandered through the woods for hours, paying attention to landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. At one point, I found an old hunting blind up in a tree and climbed up to rest for a bit. From up there, I could see the thick forest stretching out in every direction. It made me feel even smaller and more alone. When I got back to the cabin that evening, the front door was slightly open. I know for a fact I had closed it when I left. I remember turning the latch. My heart started racing. I stood on the porch for a few seconds, trying to listen, but everything was silent. Slowly, I stepped inside. Nothing looked out of place. My bag was still by the couch, the kitchen looked the same, and the bedroom door was still shut. I walked through the cabin, checking each room. I even opened the cabinets and looked under the bed. Nothing. No sign of anyone having been there. I closed the door and wedged a chair under the handle just in case. That night was worse. I didn't sleep much at all. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch. They were slow and heavy. I held my breath and stayed completely still. The steps moved from one side of the porch to the other, then stopped. After a few minutes, I got up quietly and peeked through the small window beside the door. I couldn't see anything. I stood there for a long time, waiting. Eventually, I heard the steps again, this time moving away from the cabin. I stayed up the rest of the night with the axe by my side. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. The dirt in front of the steps looked slightly disturbed, but I couldn't tell if it was from an animal or not. I considered leaving that day, but something in me didn't want to back down. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could handle it. So I stayed. I decided to make sure no one could sneak up on me again. I tied some empty cans to strings and hung them around the perimeter of the clearing. That way, if anything moved through, I'd hear it. I also moved the table in front of the door and put the axe under my pillow. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening. Just after 1 a.m., I heard a can rattle. Just one. It stopped as quickly as it started. My heart started pounding. I stayed frozen in bed, every muscle tense. A few minutes later, I heard another can rattle, this time on the opposite side of the cabin. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing. After what felt like an hour, I finally dozed off, exhausted. In the morning, I checked the strings. 2 of them had been cut. Clean cuts like with a knife. That was it. I packed up my things and loaded the truck. Before leaving, I walked the perimeter one last time. That's when I found the footprints. They were human, barefoot, and they were all around the cabin. Some of them were on top of my boot prints from the day before. Whoever it was had been circling the place while I was inside. Watching, I drove out fast, barely stopping to check the trail. I didn't relax until I hit the highway and had cell service again. I called my dad and told him everything. He didn't say much, just listened. Later that day, he called the sheriff's office in the county where the cabin was. They sent someone out to check. They didn't find anyone, but they did see the cut strings and the footprints. They said it was probably a squatter or someone living off the grid. I haven't gone back since. My dad ended up selling the cabin a few months later to a guy who wanted to fix it up. I still think about it sometimes. What could have happened if I had stayed one more night? I try not to let my mind wander too far down that road. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was a real person. That's what scares me the most. That someone was out there, walking barefoot through the woods, cutting my warning strings, and watching me sleep from the trees. And I'll never know why.